Chapter 47, Part 2 of Autobiography, Memories, and Experiences, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Arlene Stebbins. Autobiography, Memories, and Experiences, Volume 2, by Moncure Conway. Chapter 47, Part 2. A year or so later, while revisiting Stratford-on-Avon, I asked the eldest of the girls, Rosalie Flower, about the Fräulein and whether she remembered the charming walk we had with that lady through the fields. Yes, she remembered it well, but also a disappointment of herself and her sisters. While the Fräulein and I were conversing, the children had gathered daisies and violets and wild roses and strewn them on the path before us, and neither of us had taken the least notice of their homage. I took the lesson to heart, and went another stage in my earthward pilgrimage. What, after all, had Shakespeare and Goethe really been to me if they had not given me eyes to read a poem acted under my very nose, as sweet as any they ever wrote? Of what use to stand on their great shoulders if my eyes were so riveted on the shoulders that I could not heed the flowers of living hearts strewn on my pathway? Around each strewn flower was a prettier rainbow than Sorby had shown me in the spectrum of rose or violet. They had shone in vain, and the dear little hearts had been humiliated. The beautiful hour in the fields could not be recalled. Its chief beauty had bloomed inside me, and withered, and I never saw it. Had I seen it at the time, it would never have withered. Let no flower of the spring pass by thee. Ah, wisest of men! The subjects of my discourse were advertised, and one on the pre-Darwinite and the post-Darwinite world attracted Darwin. I was told that he listened to it, but he rarely came to London, and probably the discourse was reported to him. I soon after received an invitation to visit him at Down, his house near Bromley. I went to Bromley with the Wedgwoods. Hensley Wedgwood was a very interesting gentleman, but inclined to put some faith in occultism. Mrs. Wedgwood told me anecdotes about her brother, Darwin, one of which is quaint. Darwin could never realize the world-wide impression made by his discovery, nor his own fame. Gladstone, then Prime Minister, being in the neighbourhood of Down, had called. When he had gone, Darwin said, "To think of such a great man coming to see me!" The other guests at Down, besides the Wedgwoods and myself, were my friends Charles Norton and his sister of Cambridge, Massachusetts. A sister of Mrs. Charles Norton married a son of Darwin. Darwin was not in perfect health, and his wife and daughter took care that he should retire early. My opportunity for conversing with him came next day. In the soft spring morning before sunrise, I looked out of my bedroom window and saw Darwin in his garden, inspecting his flowers. His grey head was bent to each bush as if bidding it good morning. And what a head! All that the phrenologists had written was feeble compared with a look at that big head with its wonderful dome, and the lobes above each luminous eye. All the forms of organic nature had contributed something to represent them visibly in the constitution of the head to be able to interpret them. I was soon with Darwin in the garden, which was in floral glory. He expressed satisfaction that I had been able to derive from evolution the hopeful religion set forth in my discourse, but I remember that he did not express agreement with it. He spoke pleasantly of W. J. Fox, M.P., my predecessor at South Place, whom he well knew, and asked me about Emerson, whose writings interested him. But he had not been aware of the extent of Emerson's poetic anticipations of his discovery many years before it was published. While we were talking of these things, the birds began to insist on his attention. One in particular, a hermit thrush, perched on the topmost point of a tree, continued long his marvellous song. From my point of view he was justifying his hermit profession by a Vedic hymn to the rising sun, but Darwin considered that he was no real hermit or yogi at all, but had a love affair on hand and was singing a canticle to his beloved. When we were presently at breakfast the post came, a pile of letters which the daughters began to open, separating from those of friends the large number from strangers in all parts of the world. A few of these were read aloud for our amusement, letters from crude people reporting to Darwin observations which they believed important. One American farmer wrote about the marvelous intelligence of his dog, who always knew when he was about to take a walk, dancing about so soon as he touched his cane. One had some commonplaces to tell about his new variety of beans, another something about his pigeons. The rest of us laughed, but Darwin said, "Let them all be pleasantly answered. It is something to have people observing the things in their gardens and barnyards." Adjoining the house was the conservatory in which Darwin carried on his experiments. Into this he invited me, overcoming my hesitation by saying that he particularly desired it. I felt indeed that it was right, because I was minister of the chief rationalistic congregation, and was endeavoring to transfer the religious sentiment from a supernatural to a scientific basis. He took pains to show me everything. There was the enclosure in which he and Sir John Lubbock, who resided near him, conducted their experiments with ants. But Darwin was at that time chiefly occupied with the earthworm, his volume on which impresses me as next to his Origin of Species in value. Darwin's unbelief in all varieties of religious theory was not at that time known to me, although a letter of his, afterwards printed, shows that he must have thought my vision of post-Darwinite religion an illusion. No word of that kind fell from him. His kindly spirit, his interest in the ideas animating liberal ministers, indicating his desire that we should all work out his discovery in its moral applications in our own several ways. It was not exactly his realm, and he knew its importance too well to venture much even theoretically upon it. In the afternoon we had some drives in the neighborhood, and no doubt passed by without notice the famous Tom Paine tree, which I visited with interest many years later. The visit to the Down was charming. It stands in my loving remembrance as an era related to that in which I first met Emerson in his home in Concord, but it involved a new departure in my earthward pilgrimage. When Dr. Holmes said to me, "You and I have had to spend many of our best years simply clearing away theological rubbish out of our paths," the tone was as of a thing achieved. I so received it with a feeling of being right at last, but alas, how much had yet to be cleared away! Terrible discoveries awaited me. My devotion to science and my knowledge of the veracity of scientific men had been unconsciously projected into the cosmos. Nature surely was true, the laws and forces of the universe were true, evolution was carrying out sleeplessly the truth of things. In natural selection I seemed to find a gospel of reality. I had supposed that I had got to the heart of Darwin's works, but somehow the simple grandeur of that man beside those little creatures he was studying began to obtrude the shady side of nature in a disturbing way. Was that nature's truth? What were Venus flytraps but deceitful vampires? What were those little insects I used to watch so curiously in the Virginia woods, which pretended to be sticks or leaves? Their mimicry was a justifiable stratagem to escape their enemies. But why should there be this predatory character extending to all the byways of nature? Did every tint on the butterfly disguise an agony? The blossom-like flies, or the leaf and twig insects may be disguised to escape an enemy, or to lurk for tiny victims of their own. In either case they represented a predatory universe. Renan took the generous view, as Darwin did when listening to the hermit thrush, of the amorous heart of nature. Nature decorates herself with a flower to find a husband. But even in sexual selection there is a suggestion of resort to contrivances and subterfuges, pointing to love's weakness, not to its omnipotence. Was my old Methodist hymn not so wrong after all? This world is all a fleeting show, for man's delusion given. Given. We have imported the all-enclosing delusion into the world by the fantasy that all is from an omnipotent giver. My pilgrimage from Darwin's door steadily carried me past the last giant despair, a dynamic deity and creator responsible for the wrongs and agonies of nature. 1882. Darwin and Emerson died at nearly the same time, April 20 and April 27, 1882. The relation of these two minds to each other and to their time is striking. In the year 1836, when Darwin abandoned theology to study nature, Emerson, having also abandoned theology, published his first book, Nature, whose theme is evolution. It was a notable circumstance that on the death of these two men, who have done away with supernaturalism, no voice of odium theologicum broke the homage of England and America. The scene in Westminster Abbey at the burial of Darwin was impressive. From the chapel of St. Faith, the body of the great man was borne by the procession along the remote cloisters. We who had long been in our appointed seats in the Abbey presently heard a faint melodious strain. Nearer, the dirge of the invisible choir approached, and when at length the great door of the Abbey opened, and the choristers appeared, and the coffin laden with wreaths from all parts of Europe, a stir of emotion passed through the waiting company. There were following that coffin more than 100 of the first men in England, and some from other countries. On many faces the grief was visible. Huxley, Tyndall, Francis Galton, Sir John Lubbock, Sir Joseph Hooker could with difficulty control their grief. It was dark in the Abbey, and the lights but feebly struggled with the gloom. There was something almost spectral in the slow moving of the procession with noiseless tread. Around in every direction the throng of marble statues were discernible, as if a cloud of witnesses gathered to receive the newcomer in their Valhalla. But it was an earthly Valhalla. The darkness of the Abbey, only made visible by occasional lamps, might have been regarded by saints of the still radiant windows as emblematic of the curtain drawn by knowledge beyond the grave. To me the gloom deepened when the service thanked God for removing such a man out of this wicked world, but lifted a little when the white-robed choristers gathered around the three graves, those of Newton, Herschel, and Darwin, and sang a new anthem, "Happy is the man that findeth wisdom." Amid the universal homage to Darwin, one adverse sentiment is widely noted and rebuked. L'Univers, the Roman Catholic organ in Paris, said, "When hypothesis tends to nothing less than the destruction of faith, the shutting out of God from the heart of man, and the diffusion of the filthy leprosy of materialism, the savant who invents and propagates them is either a criminal or a fool." Voilà ce que nous avons à dire du Darwin des singes. Paris, 1900. How far away appears the year when I wrote down my impressions of the funeral of Darwin. I cannot discover in history any 18 years so marked by changes in the moral condition of the world as those that have followed that time. It now looks to me like the closing of an epoch, ominously marked by the graves of the great whose ideals are interred with them. The Roman Catholic organ in Paris, which in 1882 was denounced for its brutal words on Darwin, had its revanche in 1900. On the eve of the International Peace Congress, about to be held in Paris, L'Univers publishes an article that falls on our midsummer like Arctic cold. The spirit of peace, it declares, has fled the earth because Darwinism has taken possession of it. The pleas for peace have been inspired by a faith in the divine nature and origin of men. They were all seen as children of one Father, and war was fratricide. But now that men are seen as the children of apes, what matters it whether they are slaughtered or not? So runs through its column the terrible article, terrible by reason of the passionate earnestness with which it represents its day of judgment. It is small consolation to defend moral corollaries of science by saying that where the bee sucks honey the spider sucks poison. For to those filled with horror by the murderous aggressions of strong nations on the weak, the proverb can only suggest that the spider is taking possession of the world. Seated here in Paris while the Exposition is presenting at the close of the century a picture of the harmonious industrial nation distributed through all nations, L'Univers opens before me a dreary prospect of decivilization and decadence. The humanitarian spirit that breathed through the literature and art of England and America for 50 years, 1832 to 1882, is entombed in a sepulchre which few even garnish, while the mourners groan grey, who share its spirit, are helpless as the women who heard the cry of their dying leader, my power, why hast thou forsaken me?" 1903. It has become necessary entirely to revise the bearings of science on ethics. My friend Goldwin Smith, whose 80 years have only matured his wisdom, foresees fatal results to the next generation unless science can construct something to take place of the failing religious conscience, and Herbert Spencer sees that the fatality has already come. I quote their letters elsewhere. Apprehensions of this kind have long beset rationalistic preachers and publicists, of whom some have been swept away by the floods of jingoism and militantism. Had the Roman Catholic writer in Paris, who said Darwin had slain peace, followed his own doctrines to their logical result, he would have seen that they include belief in the providential character of all the evils and agonies of the world, also that Darwin and the apes are equally a part of the eternal order with the Pope and his crusaders. Yet I cannot help recognizing the terrible fact under the anathema on science. The basis of democracy is as much the misquoted affirmation of the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal. Its strictly religious essence has been lost by the substitution of born for created. Republicanism, democracy, Negro emancipation were all based on belief in the fatherhood of God and the brotherhood of man. The religious sanction, having broken down its place, cannot be taken by science until all human beings are scientific. No class of men in the modern world are of higher character in all the relations of life, private and public, than the men of science. The man of science lives in the presence of tremendous forces. He is trained in the knowledge of cause and effect. His hourly instruction is in laws that fail not, and which no prayer or penitence can escape. He knows that his every action to man or woman or child is taken up by forces impartial between good and evil, pain and pleasure, and carried on to unending results. Science alone understands the reality in this world of that hell and heaven which superstition has located in a future world where they have lost actuality in the minds they once controlled. The men of science may not believe in the continuance of individual consciousness after death, because, as Darwin said, they are exacting in the matter of evidence. But a very long existence is given by the scientific imagination which travels from the dawn of life on our planet to the reign of man, and anticipates the remotest future of nature which present forces are determining. Were it possible that the masses of mankind could be developed out of the mass and become individual thinkers, science would surely reach them with its saving grace of self-restraint, while delivering them from the ethical fictions which obstruct the moral freedom essential to happiness. But is this possible? The masses of mankind have a reverence for science, because they live and move and have their being amid its practical results, and witness its miracles. They are steadily withdrawn from the ancient miracles wrought by gods and saints for remote lands in other ages, not by criticism or rationalism, but by the miracles of science benefiting the people of today. In May 1874 the scientific men predicted several weeks before it occurred that the tide would rise to a great height in the Thames on a certain day in June. It happened to be the day of the burial of Dr. Livingstone. Barriers and breaks were built by the riverside, and on the day named the vast crowd which had gathered at Westminster Abbey at the funeral of Livingstone repaired to the bridge embankment to see what would happen. There was a halcyon superstition that the high tide of the Thames could not rise while the swans were nesting. They were just then nesting, and so it was that there was a sort of contest between superstition and science. When the waiting thousands that day saw the tide steadily rising and beating against the high barriers which protected their homes, I could see in many faces the rising tide of reverence for science. By innumerable experiences of this kind the newer science has supplanted the old, and the institutions founded on the antiquated science, the churches and temples, can only maintain themselves by their importance to the practical interests of mankind. How many millions would be impoverished were all temples closed? but the high personal character of scientific men generally is not due to the results or to the discoveries of science, which is as impartial as nature between good and evil, and as progressive in the instruments of destruction as in those of welfare. Their superiority is derived from the scientific training, the habit of thinking, of reflection, the philosophic mind engendered. Even men of science do not always attain the scientific habit of mind. Mr. Crookes adopted spiritism after experiments with 2 women. One afterwards confessed the other as an exposed impostor, whom he was probably too polite to deal with as searchingly as with his chemicals, or as he would have dealt with male mediums. One of these mediums gave semi-public séances near the British Museum every week, and 2 scientific assistants of this institution went on one occasion provided with a pocket apparatus for illuminating the room. After the medium had been tied in the cabinet, the lights were lowered, and the spirit moved about in the room. One of the 2 from the museum clasped the apparition while his colleague illuminated the room, despite the blows of a manager rained on them. The spirit proved to be the medium herself, professedly bound in the cabinet. The facts being undeniable, Alfred Wallace wrote to the Times, explaining that the spirits might conceivably in some cases utilize the body of the medium. That the spirits should select for this unusual course an evening when scientific men had come with an apparatus to expose their, the spirits, chief medium was an absurdity that occurred to everybody except Wallace. The brain of Wallace is a fair loom, but one could not look to it for any judgment on the soundness or unsoundness of the threads it weaves. As for Mr. Crookes, he remains inexplicable. I last met this agreeable gentleman in a company at the Royal Institution, and Tyndall told me that when in conversation he had alluded to spiritism, Mr. Crookes was silent, and it seemed to give him so much pain that he concluded never to mention the subject to him again. End of chapter 47, part 2. Chapter 48, Part 1 of Autobiography, Memories and Experiences, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Arlene Stebbins. Autobiography, Memories and Experiences, Volume 2 by Moncure Conway. Chapter 48, Part 1. In October 1876 we went to reside in Hamlet House, Hammersmith. It was an old but not ancient mansion, built about 100 years before. It was surrounded by nearly 3 acres of ground with stately trees, classic statues amid them, large lawn in front, rose garden at the back, and behind that fruit trees, of which some were of rare excellence. The lease made out for this old homestead interested me a good deal, not only because I had to pay for it, 20 guineas, I think, but because of the number of engagements I had to make, such as taking care of bridges and watercourses. As these serious-looking contracts referred to things that had been detached from the estate for a century, I had no fear of signing them. But when the lawyer read out that I was to take care of the deadlocks, I demanded, "What is a deadlock?" Neither he nor my landlord could answer, and there being no dictionary in the room, one had to be sent for. There had not been a deadlock in Hamlet House since about 60 years before. It was used as a school for young ladies, who, after their retirement at night, were secured by those external bolts. Although the doors had many times been repainted, I could see near the top a faint indication of where the deadlock had been. Had everything that had disappeared from Hamlet House and grounds disappeared also from the lease, this could have required only 2 or 3 pages. But how then could the lawyer get his guineas? My lease rested on a great conservative principle. Although church rates had been abolished by Parliament, the collector for Kensington parish called with a bill of 7 and 6pence for the church. When I expressed my astonishment and said I could not pay such a tax, he told me that I could not be compelled, but that the agreement to pay it had always continued in the lease of Hamlet House. The lease being brought out, I found that I had signed an agreement to pay the usual charges and taxes. Perhaps I should have refused to pay an implicit tax of this kind, But during my 3 years at Hamlet House I paid this annual 7 and 6d. I believe the tenant of Hamlet House had some privilege in the selection of a pew in Kensington Church, which, however, I never entered except once for a wedding. In 1878 Sir Charles Dyke requested me to act as one of his committee in Hammersmith, and although I never voted in England and always retained my American citizenship, I complied with the request. We had long been in friendly relations with Sir Charles and Lady Dyke. This first Lady Dyke was spirituelle and charming. She was appreciative of all public questions without giving herself up to any cause. Sir Charles appeared to be the coming statesman. He had in 1878 especially pleased me by a 2 hours' speech in Hammersmith, in which he alluded to the recent encroachments by royal prerogative. It was Gladstone who revived royal prerogative to abolish army purchase, a very small evil compared with the precedent set by that revival. My only function as a committeeman was to dine occasionally with Sir Charles, and listen to the talk of my colleagues. Our chairman was Mr. Beale, our excellent neighbour, whose 2 pretty daughters used to assist in our tableaux and theatricals at South Place Chapel, for we had such amusements there, and actor Mansfield in his youth managed many a pretty performance at South Place. When Beale heard that I had taken Hamlet House, he said humorously, "You are a bold man." To my delight I heard that there had been a suspicion of its being haunted, but I could find no such story about the house, and concluded that the name Hamlet on the porter's lodge had suggested the ghost. The name was that of the famous old jeweller who built the house. But Hamlet House had its legend. The old jeweller had been rich, but was ruined by building the Adelphi Theatre. His family consisted of 1 daughter, a beauty for whom Hamlet had made the finest necklace in England. She was betrothed to a lord. While the bankruptcy of Hamlet was known to but few, and unknown to his daughter, he returned from the city one afternoon with 2 gentlemen and strolled with them in the garden. Then he entered the house and told his daughter he wished to show some gentleman her necklace. She brought it, and never saw it again. Her noble fiancé having withdrawn from the engagement, Miss Hamlet made her living by school teaching. Among the happy memories connected with Hamlet House is the coming on a sweet June day in 1877 of the venerable William Lloyd Garrison and his son Francis. It was his last day in England, and we invited to luncheon some of the younger generation to whom it would be a cherished memory to have known the great liberator. He was most gracious and gave us anecdote after anecdote concerning his early struggles and his comrades. He charmed us all and inspired us with hopefulness for the future of the Southern States and the Negroes. He spoke with delight of the meetings he had attended in London, and of the eloquent women who spoke at them, and smiled at the early days in which he had been a Pharisee of the Pharisees with regard to the participation of women in public meetings. Garrison was a beautiful figure walking through the old garden with the young people clustering around him. There was a radiance about his almost snow-white head, like a halo. At the very time that Garrison was drawing around him his circle of admirers, General Grant was being lionized in a very deliberate way. I attended assemblies, now for one and next for the other. The man who sowed the seed of emancipation, and the man who, having grown grey without ever feeling a throb of sympathy for the slave, yet reaped the official and pecuniary harvest, had no apparent relation to each other. I first met ex-President Grant at a grand dinner at the Grosvenor Hotel given him by John Russell Young, then representing the New York Herald in London. I had some conversation with the ex-president, and he talked mostly of his reception by the Queen the day before. While he was at Windsor Castle a cablegram arrived from Pennsylvania, he did not say by whom sent, addressed to the Queen, thanking her for her reception of him, the news of which must have travelled very swiftly for the response to be returned before the reception was over. He also spoke of the agreeable dinner given him at Marlborough House by the Prince of Wales. It was easy to perceive that the reception given Grant in London had no heart in it. The official people wished to please the Americans, and all was properly done. But Grant's administrations were believed to have been marked by corruption, and the removal of Motley, known to have hastened his death, was ascribed to petty vengeance against Sumner. The General committed a sad mistake at the formal reception given him by the Duke of Devonshire. On this occasion the nobility wore their orders. The ex-president appeared decorated in just the same way, that is, with a flaming red riband across his breast from shoulder to waist, and a large gold badge. General Badeau wore something smaller of the same kind. There were few Americans present, but we were shocked. I was embarrassed by the inquiries made to me by Englishmen present, whether there were orders and decorations of that kind in America. Of course, I could give no explanation. My friend G. W. Smalley, if I remember rightly, told me that the gold medal was engraved with a list of Grant's victories. This incident excited ridicule, and some Americans managed to let the General understand that this bit of imitation had changed the homage of the nobility to an ex-president into an ex-president's genuflection before them. At any rate, the riband was laid aside later in the evening and not worn again in London. It was a great delight to find ourselves neighbours of the composer Edward Dannreuther. We remembered him as a boy in Cincinnati playing the organ in our Unitarian church with wonderful skill. Many a time I had watched from the pulpit his little head beyond the screen at the other end of the room, admiring his voluntaries. After leaving Cincinnati, 1862, we never heard of him until we found him in London in the circle of artistic poets whom we well knew. He had married a Greek lady and had fixed his abode at Bayswater, in the house where the poet John Sterling lived. Not far from it lived the poet's son Edward, an artist, and his two sisters, both of stately beauty. The Dannreuther house was old and full of quaint rooms and halls, and the composer had added a concert room. The walls were covered with Morris papers, the design lemons and pomegranates, and hung with pictures by Burne-Jones in his school. The furniture was antique, a fine feature being an architectural stove towering to the ceiling. Amid this environment we used to listen to the compositions in which Dannreuther had interpreted poems of his friends William Morris and Dante Rossetti before they were published. There were among his friends ladies and gentlemen enough able to sing these ballads with sympathetic skill. There was in all this poetry and in the music a certain melancholy. Those present were persons in good circumstances, the ladies refined and fair, most of the gentlemen distinguished in art or in letters. In these charming societies, for there were similar circles in several other houses, I was reminded always of the garden pictured by an incomparable Boccaccio outside Florence, where ladies and gentlemen found refuge from the plague in Florence. Their refuge was in the realm of the imagination, and the refuge of these from the coarseness and hardness and despair of London was also in that realm, but they could not attain the joyous freedom of the Italian genius. When superstitions have vanished, hell became a vulgar notion, and the god of wrath forgotten, the earthly paradise begins to rise, but with painful revelations of actual thorns wounding the poor and suffering. Again and again have I stood in Hyde Park with the humble crowd listening to William Morris, while carriages of the wealthy rolled past. He too might have enjoyed his carriage instead of trying to engrave on those hearts his transcendent sociology, and to animate them with visions of reform beautiful as the windows he stained for churches. Out there on the grass, a rude bench for his pulpit, rough people for his audience, William Morris raged against himself as one of the class of their non-producing oppressors. If I were in the situation of most of you, I should take to hard drinking. I was a listener solely from interest in the man, having no faith in any socialism except that poor people should unite in communal means for physical comfort, in order that mental individuality may increase. William Morris impressed me then as a noble but still more a pathetic figure. As I look back on the scene it appears to me tragical, for I believe his premature death was in part due to disillusion. I think of him now as one who spoke to the multitudes in an unknown tongue, as if Prospero had called up his exquisite masque for a company of comparative Calibans. Meanwhile those who really understood as well as loved him were forming their oasis to make life beautiful in the brief interval of existence. The Prometheus that brought their fire had consumed faith in the future life, and grim, remorseless London forbade any faith in a coming heaven on earth. So they gathered together in their affectionate circles. Among these assemblies at the Dannreuthers are associated in my memory with the tender melancholy of Morse's ballads, as Dannreuther translated his thoughts into sound. Across the graves of some who were guests in that circle I still bear the voices gone silent of two who sang a duet from the earthly paradise. In the white-flowered hawthorn brake, love be merry for my sake. Twine the blossoms in my hair, kiss me where I am most fair. Kiss me, love, for who knoweth what thing cometh after death? There were gala evenings at the Dannreuthers when Wagner visited London, 1877. Ferdinand Praeger, Wagner's earliest friend, persuaded him to conduct concerts of his operatic music in Albert Hall, despite his protests that it was against his principles to detach his music from dramatic action and scenery. Wagner brought Frau Materna with him, the wonderful voice which determined various tours de force in his operas. Before the concerts began, Wagner was entertained by the Dannreuthers, the guests being not only musical artists but painters and writers. G. H. Lewes and his wife were present, and I remember a display of enthusiasm by George Eliot. Wagner performed on the piano a piece just composed, unknown, I believe, to his nearest friends. It was a song, and in it were one or two passages that one might suppose beyond the compass of any voice. But Materna mastered them, one after the other, the composer's face reddening with excitement until the last note sounded, when he leaped up and seized the hands of the singer. Then George Eliot moved quickly forward to shake hands with her, though whether Materna was aware of the distinction of the woman who congratulated her was doubtful. For George Eliot, who could probably not have been drawn into so large a company by any less attraction than Wagner, had sat in her usual reserve until this brilliant performance by Materna. This German lady was handsome, gracious, and entirely free from vanity or any airs. By taking Hamlet House we were enabled to supply the South Place congregation with what it had never enjoyed in its long history, a social centre, and to entertain our many friends coming from America. For London was the great place to see Americans, and we welcomed in those years Higginson, John Fiske, Frothingham, Robert Collyer, Bayard Taylor and his wife, Eugene Schuyler, Hon. Alphonso Taft and his family, John Jay, Cyrus Field, and many another. In 1879 Bedford Park, with its artistic homes and its circle of literary men and artists, charmed us away even from beautiful Hamlet House. We built there a pretty Queen Anne house, despite my friend Herbert Spencer's wonder that a progressive should go far back in the matter of architecture. Our Inglewood, for I had gone back to my earliest remembered home in Virginia for a name, had a pretty garden, and although it was not large enough for the lawn gaieties of Hamlet House, our Inglewood Mondays had the attraction of being attended by the artists and literary people whose residence made Bedford Park a village such as Rabelais dreamed of in Theleme. Ah, the happiness of those years at Bedford Park! The walks and talks with James Syme and John Todhunter, our choice circle of Calumets, passing Sunday evenings in such genuine conversation as the presence of Syme and Todhunter, Dr. Gordon Hogg, G. H. Orpin, York Powell, Fox Bourne, and Jonathan Carr assured, the exhibitions at our art school, the university extension lectures from Sir Martin Conway, the discussions at the village club, for both ladies and gentlemen, the theatricals, tableaux vivants, masquerade, these charms for the evenings of days passed in toil made Bedford Park for my wife and myself the ideal place to which we always looked back with a wonder that any ties could ever have drawn us away from it. Sir Martin Conway and I had met at times in Cambridge as a youth distinguished for his knowledge of the history of art, and the curator of prints, not yet dreaming of the Himalayan heights on which he wrote his grand books and climbed to his title. He was lovable and brilliant, and I was sorry I could not make out some kinship. I would have liked to meet one of the English branch of our Virginia race, and heard with interest that Captain Conway had come with his family to reside near us. But during my absence from home, my wife, returning from a walk, found the cook at the door in violent altercation with two officers. and holding on with her hands to some valuables they were trying to seize. She heard the cook cry, "My mistress always pays her debts as she goes. She don't know anything to anybody." The officers said to my wife, "Isn't this the house of Captain Conway?" On being told where the house was, the officers apologized, and told my wife that the so-called captain was a fugitive from accumulated debts, and a warrant was issued to seize the furniture. We afterwards learned that his name was not Conway at all, but that he was a Scotchman with high connections. This was the only disagreeable incident in our residence at Bedford Park. A famous Ballad of Bedford Park appeared in the St. James Gazette, December 17, 1881, in which Jonathan T. Carr, founder of the village, and Norman Shaw, the architect, consult about building stores and a church, and in this connection the unknown minstrel made free with my name. "A church likewise," J.T. replies. Says Shaw, "I'll build a church, yet sore I fear the aesthetes here will leave it in the lurch." "Religion," pious Carr rejoined, "is Moncure Conway's view, is not devoid of interest, although it be not true. Then let us build a house for her wherein she may abide, and those who choose may visit her, the rest may stay outside. But lest the latter should repine, a tennis ground we'll make, where they on Sunday afternoons may recreation take." As a matter of fact, the tennis play went on through the Sunday forenoon as well as the afternoon. The clergyman of the church did not disapprove of Sunday tennis, but it thinned his congregation, and he prepared a proposal that it should be discontinued between 10 and 1 o'clock. To this he wished to get signatures, and first of all brought it to me and my wife. From fear that religious discord might arise in the harmonious village, and Sunday recreations be stopped altogether, my wife and I signed the proposal. But no other signature could the clergyman get. The young people, even some that supported the church, protested that Sunday was the only day when husbands and brothers were not at business, and there were not enough afternoon hours to accommodate them all. So we two, the most notorious heretics in Bedford Park, alone signed the clergyman's Sunday petition. End of chapter 48, part 1. Chapter 48, Part 2 of Autobiography, Memories and Experiences, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Arlene Stebbins. Autobiography, Memories and Experiences, Volume 2 by Moncure Conway. Chapter 48, Part 2. Soon after our settlement at Bedford Park came Edwin Abbey, who took great interest in our village of antique houses, all newly built, in going about which he said pleasantly that he felt as though he were walking through a water-colour. Abbey charmed everybody there by his wit and engaging personality. We were both working for Harper's Magazine, and among the pleasantest of my expeditions was our visit together to the English Lakes, 1879, which resulted in the article entitled "The English Lakes and Their Genii." Every illustration in those articles represents to me some delightful adventure. We stayed in quaint old hotels in all that region, and Abbey's anecdotes were so full of drollery that I did not feel quite sure that he had not mistaken his vocation, and should not have been either a literary or stage comedian. In May 1881 I gave an address before a Society for Promoting Religious Equality, newly formed by students of Cambridge University. Its object was to maintain the principles of the University Tests Abolition Act. This Act of Parliament, opening the universities to persons of any creed or no creed, was not made prospective. Consequently, Keble College, to which only members of the English Church are admitted, was built at Oxford, and the organization of a similar one, Selwyn, at Cambridge was announced for June 1. Its promoters meant to demand incorporation with the university, but Fawcett had framed a measure prohibiting religious tests in the universities forever, and it was in concert with him and other leaders in Parliament that the Cambridge Society was acting. My paper, therefore, was read in Clare College 8 days before the inauguration of Selwyn, as yet unbuilt, by the Earl of Powys, Lord High Steward of the University. About 200 young men were present. Under the title of The Unbinding of Prometheus, I presented my idea of the cords by which thought was still bound, and preyed upon for serving mankind in ways not authorized by the Christian Zeus. I had naturally alluded to the disenfranchisement at that moment of a constituency because of its representative's atheism, and although few present shared Bradlaugh's opinions, the anger against his persecutors was manifest. My enumeration of the burdens on religious liberty which tended to make English thinkers defiant like Prometheus was made on careful data, and in the discussions that followed my paper there was a consensus on the principles of liberty. During this visit I was a guest of Sidney Hickson, a brilliant student of science, soon afterwards appointed professor of zoology in Owens College, Manchester. His rooms were in Downing College, adjacent to the large grounds called the Wilderness. This wilderness, carpeted with long grass, fringed with flowering shrubs, and shaded by blossoming trees, was vocal not only at night but during the day with songs of the nightingales. It was all sweet and beautiful, this wilderness beside the Greek walls and columns of the college. I was admitted on the floor to hear a debate in the Cambridge Union, whose discussions are conducted as in the House of Commons. About 400 students were present, the galleries being crowded with ladies and gentlemen. The subject related to the Bradlaugh issue, and was opened with a motion that the parliamentary oath should be abolished. The youth who led in favor of the motion was, I was told, a particularly religious churchman. Yet in a speech which would have done honor to any legislature, he affirmed that the oath should be abolished as a restriction on honest thought, an encouragement to hypocrisy, and an impediment to progress. He not only objected to the religious formula, but also to the pledge of support to the monarchy which it sanctioned. He preferred the English Constitution to any other, but if the country saw fit to frame a republic, it should be free to do so. It was maintained, however, by another speaker that an oath to support Queen Victoria, her heirs and successors according to law, would admit of a legal effort to make a president her successor. There was a good deal of republicanism manifested, one speaker declaring that the advance of democracy was not to be repressed by the flickering shadow of a dying monarchy. There was also abundant heresy. One speaker, having spoken of atheists as disgusting, despicable, was called to order on the ground that no person could be permitted to use such language concerning the opinions of members of the House. The chairman called upon the speaker to withdraw his words, which he did. It was remarkable to observe what an instinct for parliamentary procedure this body of youths had acquired. There was at all times esprit de corps, loyalty to the chair, and speeches quiet and simple in language, and to the point. A few days after my return to London, I received a long telegram from the leaders of the Cambridge Religious Equality Society, saying that general consternation had been caused by the announcement that the new American minister, James Russell Lowell, was to assist in the founding of Selwyn College, the object of which was to restore creed tests in the university. They did not believe that Mr. Lowell understood the situation, and begged me to explain it to him. I had hardly read the despatch when Lowell called, and I handed it to him. He had gone too far to recede, and merely said he did not consider the affair as likely to mix him up with either party. However, he began his speech at Cambridge with an allusion to the incident. He said that when he was asked whether he knew what he was about, and if he was coming down there to join a conspiracy, he felt like the honest citizen of the 16th century who innocently contracted to supply Bonner with faggots. He assured them that his being there had no political or dogmatic significance. He was drawn there as a native of Cambridge, New England, with filial respect for Cambridge in Old England. This was not a felicitous remark for either party, for Selwyn College was not a part of the university for which he felt filial respect, but a fortress raised and armed against it, because it was now like Harvard University without any creed test. His high church hosts must have winced when they read next day in the Cambridge paper the following paragraph: "The presence of the United States minister on Wednesday among the bishops and other church dignitaries at Selwyn College was unusually suggestive. Mr. James Russell Lowell is the descendant of an old English Worcestershire family, who were led to leave England many generations ago through the persecutions of the church dignitaries of those days, men who held, according to Mr. Lowell's own humorous words, that the right of privately judging means simply that light has been granted to me for deciding on you. Today we see the eminent scholar and poet, the descendant of the Puritans and the son of a Unitarian minister of the younger Cambridge in Massachusetts, associated with English ecclesiastics in furthering the claims of an English high church college. The juxtaposition of Bishop Wordsworth and Mr. Lowell, and their concerted action in furthering the same cause, is just one of those things which no one would have ventured to predict, and which must be seen in order to be appreciated. Lowell must have supposed that I had some hand in this paragraph. If so, he was mistaken. I had nothing whatever to do with it. I lectured several times at Cambridge, and made interesting acquaintances, among these being Karl Pearson, now a professor in University College, London. In 1882 he placed in my hand a poem he had written, anonymously, entitled "The Trinity, a 19th-century Passion Play, the Son or Victory of Love. God, when he makes the prophet, does not unmake the man." Locke. It came about the time when, after having printed a discourse on Mary Magdalene, I waked up to the perception that in regarding her as an immoral woman I had followed a baseless church tradition, and the fact that the writer of this passion play had taken the same uncritical point of view prevented my returning to it at once. But I have since read it repeatedly and find it a powerful poem. Wagner planned a passion play of this kind and wrote the libretto, of which I possess a copy, but he discovered, no doubt, that the Christian world would not tolerate the idea of Jesus touched by human love, and substituted Parsifal for it. On New Year's Eve, in a wintry fog, I made my way through the plebeian portions of Bloomsbury, coming at last to a sign inscribed, "The Church of Humanity." Entering by a narrow hall, I found myself in a room that touched my sentiment of reverence. This was the first room in the world religiously dedicated to the worship of humanity. One might feel here that he was beside the manger from which a great influence might come. It was nearly 3 centuries after the birth of Jesus before Christianity possessed a temple of its own. Auguste Comte died in 1857. And within 25 years thereafter his philosophy had received in great hospitable London the vestments of a religion. I had met the positivist priest, Dr. Congreve, at the Priory, the residence of G. H. Lewes, and had remarked the especial esteem for him manifested by George Eliot. Subsequently I had several interviews with him, and discovered in him a phenomenal man, a refined scholar, with that elegance of look and presence which marks the real nobleman. But his statements impressed me as curiously academic. He had such unquestioning faith in his creed and church that he might have grown on the left side of the stem that bore Cardinal Newman. He showed no disposition to qualify or to interpret in a strained sense any formula. When I urged that humanity as a whole could hardly be worshipped, so many were its crimes and cruelties, Dr. Congreve simply answered that one loves his mother whatever her faults. But a deity must have no faults. He desired to win to his church the common people, and thought it could be done by cult and ritual. Women especially need symbolic forms and expressions, he said. At the Festival of Holy Women on the morning of December 31st, 1880, I counted 48 persons, 2/3 being lady of social distinction and wealth. The small room half wainscoted, half blue up to the low ceiling, the walls ennobled by sculptured heads of great men. The small pulpit barely raised above the floor and surrounded with lofty flowers. Above it a very large engraving of the Dresden Madonna. These combined to make a mystically beautiful frame for some great symbol of all that is supreme in nature. The Madonna and her babe floating in the air were too exotic. The portrait of Comte's much idealized Clotilde de Vaux, neither spiritual nor beautiful, was out of place among the persons exalted on the walls. Were all those saints of the positivist calendar detached from their faults, and their virtues combined in one being, would even that miraculous being captivate these 48 hearts, or satisfy all of those deep, inexpressible longings that stir within us with energies transmitted from myriad forms through immortal ages? Dr. Congreve's discourse was about St. Monica, Beatrice, Eloise, Joan of Arc, others being briefly alluded to, and at the close he read the fine lines from George Eliot's Jubal, "O may I join the choir invisible." In the reading he was animated and impressive. Next day, New Year's Day, was the Festival of Humanity, and that too I attended. The church had only been opened in the previous September, and its little organ for the first time uttered its voice that New Year's Day. About 60 were present, among them some fine-looking young men. After the voluntary (there was no singing), Dr. Congreve said that they would be able to translate into their own meaning the words of Isaiah, and proceeded to read the 60th chapter, "Arise, shine," etc. Then the company arose and stood with open eyes and without bowed heads, while Dr. Congreve uttered an ascription to the great power whom we here acknowledge as the highest humanity, in which the petitional "May we" occurred twice, the audience responding "Amen." The sermon was an expansion of the benediction. The faith of humanity, the hope of humanity, the love of humanity bring you comfort and teach you sympathy, give you peace in yourselves and peace with others now and forever. Amen. During all this I was not conscious of other emotion than wondering respect for this small company of cultured people, whose religion had entirely turned away from the heavens, and had enshrined humanity. It was all pathetically picturesque, but no more, because this positivist deity was to me another incomprehensible like the Triune. No such entity as humanity do I find conceivable. In the effort my imagination is lost in a vast cloud with many nuclei, here of man-faced bipeds devouring or slaying each other, there of men helping each other. But can one define humanity without distinguishing those great ones whose busts looked down upon us from the wall, and those who looked up to them with reverence from the vast swarm of irrational man-shaped beings, who set as inorganically as the destructive elements? At times I had my desk at South Place occupied by one or another of the positivists. Henry Crompton, Dr. Congreve's leading assistant, gave us a memorable discourse, and Frederick Harrison several, but in none of their discourses could I find any clear definition of divine humanity. I gradually reached a belief that positivist religion is a refined variety of the general democratization of Christianity. Mankind, in worshipping one or another terrestrial being assumed to be of their kind, are really worshipping qualities and powers that could not possibly exist in any actual being. The very names, Zoroaster, Buddha, Christ, Mohammed, are not personal names, but labels for the stored-up ideals of races in immemorial time. While these systems represent a worship by each race of its own humanity, the positivist, such was my theory, has fused those diverse humanities into one, but in detaching a religion of humanity from its traditional sovereigns, it has not relapsed into anarchy, but established a ministerial cabinet in its calendar of saints. Although the positivists are thus not really worshipping an actual but an idealized humanity, this word is ambiguous. Could their system be popularized, the collectivist sense of humanity must predominate, and above all the great historic men and women of their calendar be raised the unreason, superstitions, and passions of the masses. But how precious were, and are, these high-principled men and women with their unique philosophic faith, amid the sea of doubts and polemics mostly aimless. How beautiful in my remembrance are the homes and the lives of those whom we knew personally, and how enviable at times their faith appeared. In 1884, when Mrs. Frederick Harrison fell ill, the probability that this lovely and devoted positivist might die filled all liberal circles with alarm, and also the many homes of the poor in which her charities were known. When this danger was suspended over Frederick Harrison, he steadily fulfilled his duties as well as hers towards those who depended on them. At this time I received from him a private letter which I afterwards told him I might some day print, and it is here subjoined. It is dated 28 Gutenberg, 97, 3 September 1884. I thank you heartily for your friendly letter of sympathy and inquiry. It is quite true that my reply to Herbert Spencer was written, or rather printed, under pretence of great anxiety. It is in a season like this, for this illness has had every element of alarm and distress, that the strength of what is called religion is brought to the test of personal experience. To her and to myself I will say that our belief has been one of unspeakable comfort. At no instant and in no form has it failed either of us. One smiles to think how trumpery and how incongruous at such a season are the vulgar resources of theological convention. I have never before so clearly realized all that a human religion means, how completely one's deepest beliefs and hopes coincide with, instead of having mere complicity with, the medical cares and provisions, how one feels to rest on the cooperation of one's fellow beings, consciously and unconsciously, some of them in sympathy, some in the saving and recovery of health, how the very instruments of science, the morphia needle, and the like, seem revelations, and doctors, relations, friends, and nurses seem transfigured ministers of humanity. I will tell our secretary to send you the printed programs. You will see Times and Pall Mall advertisements of our doings on the 5th, Friday next. At 5 p.m. I give an address on Comte, very much in the spirit which you indicate and which I largely share. At 6:30 we dine in the Strand, and at 8:30 there will be a social meeting and music at Newton Hall. All are open, and we shall be glad to see you and yours at any of these. I hope to meet you before you return to America, which, in common with all your friends, I do so much regret. I remember across 20 years the brilliancy of that discourse on Comte, and others by Frederic Harrison. It was one of the great experiences of life to pick one's way along the narrow and dingy purlieus leading out of the Strand, and pass by an alley into the little hall with the grand name where Frederic Harrison, without any trick of gesture or rhetoric, made every mind and heart one with his own in sympathy, and for that happy hour one in thought. End of chapter 48. Chapter 49, Part 1 of Autobiography, Memories and Experiences, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Arlene Stebbins. Autobiography, Memories and Experiences, Volume 2 by Moncure Conway. Chapter 49, Part 1. The Right Honourable W. E. Forster was the most fair-minded, liberal, and charitable statesman who ever opened a Pandora box. To him, as Cabinet Minister, was confided the framing of the new public school system. In presenting it in Parliament, he said that the government, in trying to deal with the proverbial religious difficulty, had found itself confronted with the irreligious difficulty. From that epigrammatic phrase flew out all manner of angry conflicts. The clergy and the dissenting ministers had for generations alike been imbreeding the belief that morality depended entirely on religion, and religion on the Bible, and this imported much heat into the controversies. The atmosphere became charged with polemics. In 1870 an accomplished casuist, Dr. Liddon, preached the Lenten sermons at St. James, and arraigned the famous Unitarians, quoting their tributes to Christ, then claimed that they could not logically go so far unless they went farther. Unless Christ was divine, supernaturally born, and wrought miracles, they must regard him as self-seeking and egotistical, his influence in history a successful imposture. Liddon was made canon of St. Paul's, whose guns he turned on Westminster Abbey, where Canon Farrar, scholarly and vigorous but rather rhetorical, was repudiating hell and eternal punishment. Professor Huxley, as candidate for the school board, was assailed by the orthodox, and protoplasm, evolution, agnosticism were discussed at the hustings. In fact, London in the 70s had become a Mars Hill. Then came a scientific apostle. This was William Kingdom Clifford, appointed Professor of Applied Mathematics at University College, London, in 1871. His coming to London was a great event. At 27 he was regarded by the leading scientific men as their peer, and he had gone through all the phases of religious faith into well-informed freedom. He had a winning personality, irresistible indeed, and in public speaking could charm alike the Royal Society or a popular audience. Our acquaintance made at Cambridge became friendship in London, and my wife and I used to attend the weekly evenings in his rooms when his friends, among them always Lady Pollock and her sons, gathered around him. With Professor Clifford I had some droll adventures with mediums. The chief thaumaturgist was Mrs. Guppy, who had séances at her house in Hampstead. At a discussion in South Place Chapel I was challenged to test this medium, and took Clifford along. A dozen sat around a table, but we two were the only unbelievers. Handsome Mrs. Guppy appeared in fine décolletage. I was placed on one side of her, Clifford on the other, and we both knew that it was not she who was to do the tricks. There were raps ordering the gas lights to be put out, and each one of the company to choose something to be thrown on the table, something likely to be near by. The door was locked, the key given me to hold, and before the lights were turned off I examined the room, which was nearly without furniture. Various things were called for: a rose, a slipper, an onion, violets, a sausage, etc. Clifford demanded a small plate of artificial teeth, which were in the pocket of his overcoat in the hall. I said it was necessary to call for something not easily concealed under a dress, and demanded a large bandbox. When the lights were turned on, everything called for was on the table except what Clifford and I had demanded. Mrs. Guppy admitted the séance to be a failure, and did not venture on any further experiment. Another experiment was with the famous Williams. The séance was in my house. The method of Williams was that we should surround the table, finger hooked in finger. Then in the dark he would make some excuse for changing the finger, and contrive to get those on each side of him to hook the forefinger and little finger of the same hand, leaving one of his hands free to do the tricks. Clifford had heard of that device and warned me. When we had been seated for some time, Williams said his finger held by Clifford was weary, and proposed to change it. But Clifford in a low voice declined on his side, as I did on mine. Whereupon Williams raised the light and rushed out of the house, leaving his accordion and banjo, which I sent to him the next day. Several credulous ladies who had been victimized by Williams were present, and had the detection explained to them. Williams was broken up in London by this exposure, and the last I heard of him was at Rotterdam, where the customs officers seized his paraphernalia of wigs, masks, rag hands, and phosphorus. After the marriage of Clifford in April 1875 to Miss Lucy Lane, now distinguished in the world of letters, we often met them. He was the idol of children as well as of parents. His resources in getting up home entertainments were as inexhaustible as his resources for charming all varieties of minds by his lectures. Scientific men consulted him about their theories, artists about their pictures, skeptical theologians about their speculations. Clifford had a strong feeling that scientific men were not in sufficient relation with the general intelligence of the country, and not doing enough to liberate the people of all classes from degrading dogmas. In one of our talks it was arranged that there should be summoned a Congress of liberal thinkers. This Congress was held on June 13 and 14, 1878, in my South Place Chapel. It was the great centenary year of Voltaire, and I came to it fresh from the great festival in Paris. May 30. Our Congress brought together leading men from all parts of the United Kingdom, and some from other European countries, from India, and from America. Nearly all of these 400 congressmen, including several congresswomen, represented some congregation or society. We had broad churchmen, Unitarians, secularists, theists, and we had a tower of strength in my American friend, Wentworth Higginson. At the end of 2 days' discussion, an association was formed, its aim being defined as 1. The scientific study of religious phenomena. 2. The collection and diffusion of information concerning religious movements throughout the world. 3. The emancipation of mankind from the spirit of superstition. 4. Fellowship among liberal thinkers of all races. 5. The promotion of the culture, progress, and moral welfare of mankind, and of whatever in any form of religion may tend towards that end. 6. Membership in this association shall leave each individual responsible for his own opinion alone, and in no degree affect his relations with other associations. The presidency of the association was conferred on Professor Huxley and by him accepted. I remember well the satisfaction with which, referring to the eminent names in the membership, Huxley said, "Freethinkers are no longer to be simply bullied." Several important men had discouraged our effort. Dr. James Martineau, who regretted that he could not attend, being at his summer house in Scotland, expressed his belief that negation supplies no bond. It has its work to do, a legitimate work which I am far from depreciating, but in my opinion this work must be individually done, and beyond it a good deal must happen before religious combination becomes possible. Matthew Arnold wrote, "I am strongly of opinion that the errors of popular religion in this country are to be dispersed by the spread of a better and wider culture, far more than by direct antagonism and religious counter-movements." On the other hand, the encouragements were much more numerous. Max Müller, Pieton, Karl Blind, Dr. M. Kalish, Leslie Stevenson, A. J. Ellis, F.R.S., Professor Estlin Carpenter, and indeed most of the younger generation of Unitarians and of the secularists responded eagerly. Letters full of sympathy came to us from the Continent, from Littré, Professor Hugenholtz of Holland, Professor T. H. Bost of Verviers, M. Émile de Harven of Antwerp, and M. Fix, editor of La Religion laïque, came from Belgium and gave an address to the Congress. But alas, Clifford was not there. His health had broken down in April, and under peremptory warning he had gone with his wife to the Mediterranean. While the Congress was in session I received a letter from him, written May 23, on the Morocco, en route from Fiume to Malta, saying how hard he had tried to write a paper for the occasion. A relapse at Venice had rendered it impossible, and he could only send me some notes he had made of the points he had meant to enlarge on. The notes are these. Catholics are fond of saying that an age of atheism is approaching in which we shall throw over all moral obligations and society will go to ruin. Then we shall see what is the true effect of all our liberal and scientific teaching. As a matter of fact, however, even themselves admit that the public conscience is growing in strength and straightness, while the Catholic dogmas and organism are more and more repudiated. We may see reason to believe that the former of those facts is the cause of the latter. Part of modern unbelief is no doubt due to the wider knowledge of criticism of the so-called evidence of Christianity, but in all ages sensible men have seen through that flimsy structure. Intellectual skepticism is not really more rife than it has been in many past periods. The main ground of hope for the masses is the moral basis of skepticism. 1. Its revolt against mythology. 2. Its revolt against the priestly organization of churches. As to the mythology, the dogma of eternal damnation is being quietly dropped, not as in the Jewish part of the New Testament, but it has been practically taught by the Christian organization for 16 centuries. Therefore the Christian organization ought to be thrown away with it, for it is not an opinion like another, but a wicked thing to believe. As to the priestly organization, the practical effect of the Christian organization, the Church, has always been adverse to morality, and is now. The clergy is everywhere making more pronounced its revolt from the great principles which underlie the modern social structure. There is a strong antagonism between the Christian organization and the Jewish ethical literature, which our moral sense approves. And I believe that, so far as the Christian organization is concerned, the time has come for heeding again the ancient warning. Come out of her, my people, that ye be not partaker of her sins, and that ye receive not of her plagues. End of notes. The association elected a committee of 24, in which 2 were Hindus, Dairyaban of Bombay and Mitra of Calcutta, and also 4 ladies, with plenary powers. We had several interesting meetings at Huxley's house, but it was found impossible to organize members scattered about the world in any central or definite movement. In fact, the association, so far as any active work had been contemplated, received a mortal stroke within the year of its birth. The life of it as an organization depended on the life of Clifford, which ended March 3, 1879. The scientific and philosophical thinkers, Huxley, Sir Frederick Pollock, Tyndall, Leslie Stephen, and others, had felt that this Congress was open to a great field for the admirable young orator, so perfectly equipped as an apostle of scientific thought in its relation to religion and ethics. The association was never formally dissolved, and Huxley remained its president to the end. The committee met at his house and reached the conclusion that the 2 days' Congress had done what was needed at the time, also that no further organization was needed, or possible, in England. Every serious thinker had the means of reaching the public. Magazines and journals were hospitable to all varieties of opinion, and, as Professor Tyndall said, it was always possible to summon another Congress when occasion called for it. I discovered by that Congress that despite Martineau's assertion that negation supplies no bond, it is the only real bond between individual leaders of a people in their exodus from intellectual bondage. There were in that Congress at least 70 men prominent in their communities, either as preachers or writers, several of them clergymen of the English Church. There were several titled persons, also Hindus, and a learned African, E. W. Blyden, Liberian ambassador. These persons had here a chance to witness the enthusiasm which atheism could kindle, not only in scholarly men but in cultured ladies such as Mrs. Ernestine Rose and Mrs. Harriet Law. The venerable George Jacob Holyoake, who in early life had been imprisoned for atheism, spoke amid the children of a tolerant era. There were old friends of Emerson, among them Goodwin Barmby, who used to listen to his lectures 30 years before. Solitary thinkers who had long sat eating their hearts, feeling themselves in a world to which they had no relation, came from their retreat and made acquaintance with their kindred. To some extent this was even personal, for we gave at the end of the Congress a garden party at Hamlet House, where we then resided. Wentworth Higginson was our guest at the time, and even his old friends of Worcester and Boston might have been surprised could they have witnessed the combination of him in the radical preacher, the militant humanitarian organizer, the man of letters, and the society man. Higginson, while sympathetic with every sincere negation, held to his belief in immortality and his theism. He was thus, with his extemporaneous eloquence, precisely the man who could make the Congress a happy, cheerful one. In a sense the association ended, but as Goethe said, a beautiful thing never ends. During the remainder of my life in London I continually received evidences of happy effects of that Congress. Wonderful London! At the very moment when our Assembly was probing the foundations of religion and theoretically abolishing superstition, around us was a recrudescence of wildest fanaticism. Lord Beaconsfield's occupation of Cyprus, the raising of Cleopatra's Needle beside the Thames, and several other things set off a swarm of apocalyptic apostles shrieking about the gathering of Jews to Palestine and the second coming of Christ. There was also a recrudescence of legal persecution. One of our South Place ladies, Mrs. Flora Carnegie, the beautiful wife of a gentleman of high social position, on appearing as a witness in some small case before Magistrate Newton, was bullied by him because she refused to swear on the Bible, and Edward Truelove, a veteran bookseller, was imprisoned for selling the Malthusian Fruits of Philosophy. My Sacred Anthology and the Liberal Congress in my chapel brought me the friendship of an increasing number of able men from India, Persia, and Japan. They too were pilgrims who had found no shrine. Contact with European thought had destroyed their old faith, but offered them only dogmas more repulsive. Tatui Baba, a learned ex-priest and statesman, and his Japanese friends in London begged me to go and preach in Tokyo, and let the people know that cultured people in England and America did not believe the gospel of the missionaries. I heard rumors of a Moslem scholar wandering about London, and in want, and after a long search found him. His name was Mohammed Bakr, and he told me his story, which I afterwards verified. He knew Hebrew, and study of the Old Testament converted him temporarily to the Jewish faith. But although he became eminent among the rabbins of Syria and Armenia for his learning, his convictions were still unsettled, and at last he took up Christianity. The British missionaries at Baghdad sent him to England for clerical orders, to aid his work among Moslems in Persia. The clergy in England received him with delight at his eloquence and scholarship, but they dropped him as soon as they discovered that he simply regarded Jesus as an inspired teacher and did not accept the Trinity. On Christmas Day I found him in a garret without food or fire, shivering over his Bible and his Koran. His situation was relieved, but soon he died. He was a man of genius, but what of that? It was still a fearful thing for a Moslem to fall into the hands of the living Trinity. If London in the early 70s was a Mars Hill, towards the close of that decade a Babel in fragments appeared on the top of it. The situation was fairly represented by a large coloured cartoon of our national church, issued by an artistic cynic calling himself Eon, containing good portrait characters of the principal preachers and lay agitators in church and state politics. In the centre of the dome of St. Paul's was pictured a sort of huge parachute crowned with a bell, the handle on top being a cross. A gust tries to carry away the dome, and on each side of a split episcopal throne the bishops and canons hold it down by ropes. Some of the clergy are marching toward a tiara signpost marked "To Rome." Father Ignatius Fatuus, looking on in monk's garb with clasped hands. In a cave, Moody and Sankey are grinding a hand-organ, while Salvationist General Booth with drum and trumpet shouts to them, "Why don't yer stick to your own country?" Beneath is Bradlaugh, liberty cap in one hand and torch in the other. Spurgeon and Miall are trying to drag down the episcopal throne. Howes is playing his violin. Dr. Parker is trying to drag people to his booth, City Temple, with a drum. Stopford Brooke, Voysey, Colenso, Herbert Spencer, Frederick Harrison are all portrayed. By the Church Association a donkey says, "Let us bray." I am in a little tent marked "Conway's Free and Airy Tabernacle," having a white flag inscribed, "We move on." Above all is a bust of Darwin, beneath being a stairway of geologic strata on which a gorilla is climbing, and drawing by his tail Huxley and Tyndall. The text connected with Darwin was Genesis 27:11, "Behold, my brother is an hairy man, and I am a smooth man." Darwin, the topmost figure in the picture, on a level with St. Paul's dome, is noble, but the artist remembers the face in that of a gorilla ascending to a rising sun clothed in a cloud marked protoplasm. To each figure a scripture text is applied, and beneath the whole are the words, "A house divided against itself." I was rightly placed in my picket tent on the extreme left, almost beyond it, and associated with the texts, "We have no continuing city, let us go forth without the camp," and "He dwells at large." My isolated position as a minister, despite asperities of a few Unitarians, was no martyrdom personally, and as a public teacher it gave me advantages. I looked on all of the campus as equally struggling for error, and could weigh without bias the value of each for human happiness. For as the vision of heaven faded, the importance of happiness in this world became paramount. I could idealize any idol not worshipped by human sacrifices. My sacred anthology closes with the words of Omar Khayyam, "O my heart, thou wilt never penetrate the mysteries of the heavens. Thou wilt never reach that culminating point of wisdom which the intrepid omniscients have attained. Resign thyself then to make what little paradise thou canst here below. For as for that beyond, thou shalt arrive there, or thou shalt not." Some of my experiences as a confidant of troubled souls were such as make most religious novels commonplace. Several Robert Elsmeres poured out their hearts in my study long before Mrs. Humphrey Ward's romance was heard of. One or two Catholic priests came to relate how their Madonna had materialized in a human sweetheart. Still more were the young ladies of genius longing for some congenial task for their powers. I once by a timely visit saved a peer from suicide. The pistol was in his hand. Sometimes I received letters from evangelical preachers rebuking me for destroying faith, and read them along with letters from mothers thanking me for having interested in some kind of spiritual ideal sons who had been mere scoffers. Few indeed joined South Place Chapel except those whose theological faith had been utterly lost. My reputation for pulling down was due to the travellers through London, chiefly American. The venerable Goodwin Barmby, who came to our Congress of 1878, was a man of whom the old friends of Emerson will be glad to know something more, and I make room in this chapter for a parenthesis concerning him. End of chapter 49, part 1. Chapter 49, Part 2 of Autobiography, Memories, and Experiences, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Arlene Stebbins. Autobiography, Memories, and Experiences, Volume 2 by Moncure Conway. Chapter 49, Part 2. In 1870, John Camden Hotten engaged me to write a biographical and critical introduction to a collection of Emerson's papers. As the collection was to include early papers from The Dial, I thought it important to communicate with Emerson, who objected to the publication. The old papers were not protected, and Hotten had gone to considerable expense. Nevertheless, the thing was dropped, Hotten being rewarded by being the publisher of Emerson's Society and Solitude. My introduction was extended, and though not published was printed, and proofs were sent to the surviving friends of Emerson in England. They were used by Alexander Ireland in his book on Emerson. Not unfairly used, for I had got from him many facts relating to Emerson in England, as he had got from me many relating to Emerson in America. In 1870 I gathered up the experiences of men and women who had known Emerson, among these being Goodwin Barmby, an unclassed Unitarian minister in Suffolk. From his house, Vine's Villa, Yoxford, June 17, 1870, there came a letter which presents a glimpse of that period too entertaining to sink into my oubliette. When Emerson came to tea with me at Bayswater, he was quite enchanted with the trees in Kensington Gardens. I remember well his frequent question, "Can you show me any men and women? What life have you got here in England?" I knew well that he was aiming at the being before doing and knowing of James Pierpont Graves. He was after biography, I was for history. I had just returned from the French Revolution of 1848 and had witnessed the inspiration of a nation, and my harmony was jarred by his not appearing to sympathize with the social movement. He afterwards went to Paris and took up his abode in the lovely little apartment which I had occupied not long before in a hotel in the Rue des Beaux-Arts, and which I think I recommended to him. There he would have seen something of Hugh Doherty. My impression of Emerson was that he was the most beautifully simple and clearest-minded man I had ever met with. But I then thought that he was too much immersed in biographical ideas, which were after all a certain reflex of egotism, and that he wanted social sympathy and its gospel of self-sacrifice to make him a whole man. I have no doubt now but that your great war has made him greater. Alcott I personally liked, but he bothered me with his paganism, as it seemed pedantic, and as I knew it was not original, although his expression of it was well welded, all his own, and applicable to modern ideas. We fair-headed ones were the children of Apollo, the non-multitudinous. What then were the dark race of men? Alcott was an unconscious flatterer. He would not be personally unpleasant, but the moment a pleasant analogy occurred he put it into poetic words. Marcus Spring found me out on the strength of my verses, The Hand of Friendship. He and his wife were in London with Margaret Fuller. Mrs. Spring was one of the most winning women I ever met, and I was in rapture with her. Several times I saw Miss Fuller in their company, and she appeared very plain indeed. On one occasion I was invited for the evening to a large party, with a magnificent feast of flowers and fruits and sherbet in true orthodox fashion. But of those there I remember only two, the eldest son of Tom, the Inverary poet, a fine handsome boy, and W. J. Fox. Miss Fuller confined her talk to Fox. I had Mrs. Spring, and was I not content? Fox would have liked a quiet hand at whist better. He was fairly badgered, driven up a corner, talked to death. Miss Fuller had travelled far farther than he had from the common ruts of learning and literature. I seem to remember now that it was more of Proclus and Plotinus than Plato, but it came in a shining flow of words, and he appeared to be always retreating out of it in vain, for as step by step he went back, on came the bright waters after him. I can understand how motherhood brought the beauty of Margaret Fuller's soul into her face. The Springs invited me to spend a couple of years with them at Rhode Island, but I never dared to go. There in Goodwin Barmby's memory were the sowers that went forth to sow in the previous generation, and whose seeds we seem to be harvesting at the Liberal Congress some 30 years later. But alas, the seeds had not enough depth of earth. They blossomed brilliantly, but found no fruitage in the field of the world, and in the garish day they wither into illusions. Professor Clifford at times impressed me as a reappearance of Voltaire, and as in Voltaire an afterglimmer of the old faith was visible in his empirical speculations about deity, so in Clifford's conception of cosmic emotion the religious sentiment survived. When I heard that lecture I was deep in my demonology and devil lore, and enough Methodism survived in me to have no cosmic emotion but one of abhorrence for half of the cosmos. Especially when the cosmos was killing that splendid man. What were constellations compared to the genius of Clifford? Professor Clifford's ailment was consumption. During its rapid progress we were all under elusive hopes excited by his inexhaustible spirits. In September 1878 it became certain that he could not recover. One day when my wife and I were on our way to visit the Cliffords, we met Huxley just from the house. His face was clouded with despair, and he exclaimed, "The finest scientific mind born in England for 50 years is dying in that house." On entering we found Clifford in his armchair, serene and full of his habitual humour, his wife trying to smile. He had just been writing and showing her a skit after the style of Lucian, which he repeated to us. It represented Christ and his disciples strolling through Hyde Park and subjected to questions by suspicious policemen. The talk between St. Peter and a policeman was exquisitely comical. Clifford spoke of St. Georges Mivar's claiming the favour of scientific men for his Catholic Church on the ground of its evolution from the moral and spiritual forces of the whole world, and also something he had read concerning the superiority of that Church in bringing the humble people in contact with pictures and images. "This," he said, "is all ingenious and plausible. Families all want some church or other to go to on Sundays. But the man is in doubt between competing sects. The Catholic Church steps forward and says, 'I'm a pretty woman, choose me.'" Clifford's bequest to the world was in a sense condensed in the epitaph he wrote for his grave, where it is engraved, "I was not and was conceived. I loved and did little work. I am not and am content." There was some excitement about the admission into Highgate Cemetery of this epitaph, but such was the love for Clifford that the objectors could not venture to encounter it. In 1875, on arriving in New York, I learned that Charles Bradlaugh was ill, and his recovery doubtful, in St. Luke's Hospital, New York. I at once visited him. Owing to the skill of Doctors Leaming and Abbey, his condition had slightly improved, but he was still weak when I reached his bedside. He had been compelled to cancel many lecture engagements and was eager to sail for England. He felt, however, that his recovery was not quite certain. He had not the slightest fear of death, but remembering the legends about infidel deathbeds, was anxious lest his memory should suffer in that way. He begged me to make inquiries of nurses and doctors whether he had said or done anything during his illness which could be construed into an alteration of his opinions, and desired me, in the event of his death, to bear testimony to the facts. My own methods differed from those of Bradlaugh, but I needed no assurance about his courage. Nevertheless, I conversed with the physicians and nurses, and learned that Bradlaugh had not uttered a word suggesting regret for his unbelief or his career, and for the rest had been an uncomplaining and grateful patient. Yet Mrs. Bradlaugh Bonner, in her excellent life of her father, had to record that, Although he recovered from his illness in New York, and was alive to contradict such fables, it was actually said that he had sent for a minister to pray with him, and one clergyman was even reported to have specified the minister as a Baptist. As I was certainly the only minister who visited Bradlaugh during his illness, it is some relief to have the legend of a prayer with Bradlaugh fixed upon that mythical Baptist. Nobody will ever suspect me of having ever been a Baptist. Some one, so I was told, asked Frederick Harrison whether Matthew Arnold believed in a God, and was answered, "No, but he keeps one in his backyard to fly at people he doesn't like." I remember Matthew Arnold speaking slightingly of Theodore Parker's theology, alleging that his deity was dynamic, but his own famous definition of deity as a stream of tendency not ourselves that makes for righteousness is liable to the same criticism. That which makes is dynamic. In our invitations to the Liberal Congress in London, the word religion was used. Bradlaugh said religion had no meaning for him except as the label of certain systems and dogmas. I maintained in our talks that the word religion, though etymologically objectionable, could alone represent the sentiment all of us, including himself, had for the cause nearest our hearts. The freethinkers also had their altar. When they gave of their substance to build their hall and support lectures, none of them would propose to devote the money to relieve the physical sufferings around them. They believed, no doubt, that secularism, if generally adopted, would relieve such distress, but the orthodox also included that kind of happiness in their millennial dream. So long as we were devoting our supreme energies to a cause as yet theoretical, we had a religion. Bradlaugh agreed with the substance of my statement, but dreaded the connotations of the word religion. It had been so long and universally associated with gods, ceremonies, superstitions, that its use by a freethinker would be misleading unless accompanied each time by elaborate explanations. Because of this word religion in our circular, Bradlaugh and Mrs. Besant did not accept our invitation to the Congress of 1878. I respected Bradlaugh's ability and character, but still believed that he was, as was said of the Athenians at Mars Hill, too religious, hence his thunder and lightning. And some clergymen recognized this when the International Freethought Congress of 1881 was held. The metropolitan character of London was shown in its many congresses, and I generally attended them. Large sectarian averages were audible through their delegates, as if these were phonographs. The mass acted quasi-inorganically, and its evolution upward or downward could be studied in a congress. In 1881 the Ecumenical Methodist Conference gave a single hour of its 12 days to the great problems of thought in our time, and even that only to consideration of how they might affect Methodism. The English Church Congress, which followed it, gave nearly one of its 4 days to the discussion of those problems, considered as to their truth and their bearing on mankind. Such was the contrast between the English State Church and a popularly established American Church. Simultaneously with the Church Congress, 1881, was held in London the great International Freethought Congress. It was presided over by Dr. Ludwig Büchner. The striking thing was that the Church Congress recognized in the Freethought Congress not an enemy, but another church. In the Church Congress were such clergymen as Sarson, who had resigned his office in a reformatory because of a slight put on Annie Besant; Stuart Headlam, a gallant defender of the rights of infidels; Anderson, fraternal with all men who had ideas; and Harry Jones, the eloquent spokesman of the church contingent which carried its left wing into practical alliance with the secularists. The Rev. Harry Jones declared that secularism was growing by reason of its devotion to human welfare, and that if the Church is to prevail over it, it must be by doing more for human welfare than the secularists did. It was revealed in the discussions that some of the bishops sympathized with the spirit which desired to establish friendly relations between the Church and every English school of thought. The Bishop of Durham remarked that many past heresies had become present orthodoxies. The sentiment would have been applauded in the Freethought Congress. Dr. Ludwig Büchner was a man of grand presence. Beneath his crown of silken white hair was a face of the intellectual German type, with eyes clear and large, and mouth of feminine delicacy. His voice was soft and flexible enough to surprise one who looked at his strong brow. At the close of an eloquent speech he said, "Our work is small now, but all things have small beginnings. I trust in the future." Why? Why may not the future destroy free thought as Athenian civilization was destroyed? Because it is a religion, and men like Büchner, Haeckel, and Bradlaugh its prophets. The millennial illusion survived in us all. The parliament of religious man was going on. It seemed a chaos of antagonistic minds, but it was only the distribution in various halls of souls whose fundamental unity worked in the watchword of them all, "I trust in the future." When we have lived long enough to see what the future brings, we are hors de combat, and our similarly cheated successors think us reactionary. Professor Max Müller, in inaugurating the Hibbert Lectures, for which, though Hibbert the founder was a rationalistic Unitarian, Dean Stanley opened Jerusalem Chamber in the Abbey, affirmed the honorable functions of atheism in the evolution of religion. I had long before taken this ground, and printed a sermon entitled "Atheism, a Spectre." But Max Müller recognized religious atheism as distinguished from vulgar atheism. I think he must have had in mind some continental type of atheism consisting in political antagonism to priests and churches. But I doubt if there had been any such type, since Heine said that he had been converted from atheism by attending in Paris a meeting of atheists. Such was the pervading odour of brandy, said Heine, that what reason had not achieved was done by the sense of smell. At any rate, there was no such type in England, where the humblest atheists were thinking and reading men and women, and bore bravely a heavier cross than any of their accusers. While Max Müller was delivering that passage in the Abbey, I cast a glance at the face of Martineau, who appeared troubled, then at Dean Stanley, who was beaming. In 1880, April, Renan delivered the Hibbert Lectures, and on his arrival in London was entertained at dinner by Dean Stanley in his residence at Westminster Abbey. The centenary of Channing occurred on April 7, and though a function in Guernsey prevented the dean's presence, he wrote 2 letters which were publicly read, expressing highest homage to Channing, and begging that his absence might not be misunderstood. These letters constituted the dean's final benediction on liberalism. On July 25, 1881, he was buried in the Abbey. Dean Bradley was his successor in spirit. One day, in conversing with him, I inadvertently spoke of "the Dean," referring to Stanley, and apologized to Dean Bradley, but he said, "You spoke correctly, he was the Dean." Renan was introduced by his friend Lord Houghton to the grand audience in St. George's Hall which listened to his Hibbert Lectures. Through Houghton, as he could not speak English, he apologized for not giving his lecture standing, the English climate having brought on rheumatism. Renan stood, however, while giving his exordium, in this 10 minutes showing himself a graceful speaker. His clear, fine voice and perfect French made him easy to follow by his educated audience. The Hibbert trustees advertised as the title of his course, "The Influence of the Institutions, Thought, and Culture of Rome on Christianity, and the Development of the Catholic Church." Renan told me that the title he had sent was, "In What Sense is Christianity the Creation of Rome?" I remarked that the British Channel rolled between the 2 titles. It was an unintentional coincidence that brought the centenary of Channing and the opening lecture of Renan together. In the morning, April 7, Martineau sat by the side of Renan and heard him describe the ascending social development of Rome before Christianity got power over it. The sentiment of humanity was springing up, Stoics were preaching the rights of man, thought was free, woman enjoyed a large degree of liberty and equality. All this sacrificed to the ascetic spirit of Christianity. In the evening Martineau presided at the centenary of the great American who had endeavored under the name of Christianity to recover what was lost by its long arrest of civilization. At the close of his last lecture Renan said that mankind would "always behold in the universe the smile of a father, and that smile would be a reflection of their own." A shadow must have clouded Martineau's heart at that thought so sweetly uttered, and I could not but admire the artistic elegance with which he fulfilled his function of addressing Renan on the eve of his departure. He was 75, but never more sparkling and charming. After so many generations since the scientific founder of the Martineau race in England had emigrated from France, here was his most eminent descendant matching the finest of French writers with that felicity of manner and expression which no unmitigated Englishman of his time attained. Renan, whom I had long known, met a number of literary men at my house in Bedford Park, but Madame Renan, who was with him, had to nurse him through all the lionizing process. Her fine English being his means of communication, she had endless talking to do. Madame was alarmed lest this novel experience of receiving universal admiration should break down Renan's constitution, which had thriven on censure. The Hibbert Lectures of 1882 were given by Professor Kühnen, D.D. of Leyden University. Dr. Kühnen, then about 54, was a tall, handsome man, with a grand forehead, and with his broad, ruddy face might be mistaken for a solid member of Parliament. He gave his lectures in English, and although one had to listen carefully, there was no fault in his choice of words. His lectures were given without gesticulation or mannerism. Every sentence was freighted. He was acquainted with the condition of religious philosophy in every part of Europe. His general subject was the national and the universal religions. He began with a pregnant prologue on the Age of Darwin. This, uttered at a moment when the burial of Darwin in Westminster Abbey had set all Europe to estimating his discovery, was regarded as a judicial summing up of the modifications of religious inquiry by the Darwinian generalization. I met Kühnen in private and regarded him as a true intellectual brother of Renan in biblical and Eastern knowledge. He had not the poetic vein of Renan, but was without that desire to conciliate the traditional sentiment so transparent in the Vie de Jésus. April 21, 1895. Today, the 90th birthday of Dr. James Martineau, I visited him and found him wonderfully vigorous. I was accompanied by Virchant Gandy, the Jain scholar from Bombay, who was much impressed by Dr. Martineau's conversation on Oriental subjects. Not long before, Martineau had to address a number of nonconformist ministers, many of them orthodox, and his tact was as unfailing as ever, carrying with him the full sympathies of his audience. His latest volume, The Seat of Authority in Religion, is his ablest work, and the one most advanced in rationalism. Many supposed it impossible that an octogenarian could have written any part of such a book, and labelled the whole of it with his prefatory remark that some of it was early work. But there appeared in the 19th Century Magazine for the same month his reviews of Mr. Balfour's ingenious plea for creeds, and Martineau's genius and learning have rarely been happier. Today Unitarians throughout the country presented Martineau with an address engrossed in an album on whose cover is a silver plate engraved with the Martineau crest, a martin with the motto Marte nobilior pallas, wisdom nobler than war. My South Place Society requested me to convey to Dr. Martineau their grateful remembrance of his long and faithful services to truth and knowledge. They recognize the honor of a career which has carried the best traditions of English scholarship to the maintenance of a higher standard of intellectual honesty, and they rejoice that Dr. Martineau has lived to see, did his characteristic humility permit, noble harvests garnered, or still ripening from seeds sown by him in fields his youth found overgrown with superstition and intolerance. To this came the following reply: 35 Gordon Square, London, W.C., May 5, 1896. To the South Place, Finsbury, Congregation and Minister. Dear Mr. Conway, you will not interpret, I am sure, the late date of this letter as any sign of tardy gratitude to your congregation for their truly generous greeting on the completion of my 90th year. So profuse has been the shower of birthday addresses from the many public bodies with which a long life has connected me, that with my utmost diligence I have been unable to prevent their overflow into outlying reaches of time. So cordial a recognition of my life work as you have been commissioned to send me is the more valued for being based, as I am well aware, not on any party sympathy with the cast of my opinions, but on a common moral approval of careful research, and unreserved speech on all subjects affecting either theoretic or historical religion. The attempt to find infallible records in canonical books and permanent standards of truth in ecclesiastical votes has so hopelessly failed that honest persistence in it has become impossible to instructed persons. And therefore in all competent guides and teachers of men a continued sanction and profession of it is not simply an intellectual error, but a breach of veracity. And this tampering with sincerity on the part of instructors who know better than they choose to say, not only arrests the advance to higher truth, but eats like a canker into the morals of our time. The sophistries of unfaithful minds are as strange as they are deplorable. Whoever smothers an honest doubt creates sin, while missing the precluding good of unbelief. And the conventional outcry against destructive criticism intercepts the reconstructive thought and faith which can alone endure. I can never cease to be grateful to fellow seekers after God, whose heart is set on following the lead of his realities, and not the bent of their own wishes and prepossessions. And far above all doctrinal sympathies, orthodox or free thinking, do I prize the encouragement which your message presses home upon our common conscience, to hold fast our integrity, and trust the true and the good as alone divine. Believe me always yours very sincerely, James Martineau. When Professor F. W. Newman reached his 90th birthday, June 27, 1895, the South Place Society, which he had several times addressed, passed a resolution which gave him pleasure, and soon after I travelled to Weston-super-Mare to pass an appointed day with him. He was vigorous enough to take a good walk with me before luncheon, and although he used a magnifying glass in reading me something I could not perceive any failure of mind or memory. He was serene in spirit, and he was even elated by the honorary degree conferred by Oxford on Dr. Martineau. He took up Martineau's latest book, The Source of Authority in Religion, and read an extremely rationalistic passage. "And now," he said, "I have lived to see the man who wrote that given a degree at Oxford." There was a tone of nunc dimittis in his voice. Beautiful he stands in my memory, with his happy eyes, the white halo of his hair, his look that of one who had already, on earth, enjoyed his immortality. End of chapter 49, Part 2. Chapter 50 of Autobiography, Memories and Experiences, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Arlene Stebbins. Autobiography, Memories and Experiences, Volume 2 by Moncure Conway. Chapter 50. Not long after the death of Carlyle, I received from Emerson's daughter, Mrs. Forbes, the amazing information that the greater number of her father's letters to Carlyle could not be found. She had long before received a letter from Carlyle, of which she sent me a copy, declaring that he had never, to his knowledge, destroyed a scrap of paper on which her father's hand had rested, and all would be sent to her. There was also a memorandum to this effect connected with Carlyle's will. But when the package reached Mrs. Forbes, but few of Emerson's letters were in it. I also received from my friend Professor Charles E. Norton of Cambridge a cry of distress, he having been long chosen by all concerned to edit the correspondence. We found from Carlyle's letters, carefully preserved by Emerson, that there were more than 30 letters of Emerson missing. I consulted Mrs. Alexander Carlyle, who had lived with her uncle at the close of his life, and she informed me that she had received the package from Mr. Froude and forwarded it unopened to Mrs. Forbes. Renewed searches were made, but in vain. I was at that time a literary adviser for Harper & Brothers, and one day when I was in the office of Trübner he introduced to me a small middle-aged man who was trying to sell an important manuscript of Carlyle. The result was that on the following Sunday evening I went to the address he gave me in Kentish Town, a miserable house, where I was met at the door by the same man, apparently the only occupant. He began by saying he admired and loved me, thereby placing me on my guard. He then brought out the manuscript he wished to sell to the Harpers, Carlyle's autograph journal of his tour in Ireland. The man was unwilling to part with the manuscript even for the night, or to wait till I could consult the Harpers. The sum demanded was exorbitant, and such as, even had I authority, I could not have agreed to on a few minutes' examination. The man pretended to be acting in the interest of another to whom Carlyle had given the manuscript, and this story was repeated by Mr. Froude in his introduction to the work printed soon after. I felt certain that the manuscript had been stolen. By inquiry of Trübner I discovered that the man who offered me the manuscript had been for a time an amanuensis for Carlyle. I suppress the name because I believe he has children. About that time the London Athenaeum published 4 of the missing letters of Emerson. The editor, Mr. McColl, told me that the letters printed were selected by him from a large number, the same history being given of them as of the Irish manuscript. They had been given to his German secretary. Knowing well that Carlyle had never willingly parted with a letter of Emerson, and that the thief was the one who offered me that journal, I still did not confide my suspicions to anyone. I believe it was on a simple conjecture that they would be offered to the American minister, Lowell, that I consulted him. He had indeed been offered the letters, but declined to buy them. If he had given notice of the offer to Carlyle's executors, a good deal of trouble might have been prevented. Unfortunately, Lowell could not give me the address of those who had the letters, so for some weeks I turned myself into a detective. I discovered that the rogue had been negotiating under the alias of Beckerwaise, and that he was one of a ring. Finally, I discovered that the letters had passed to the address of William Anderson, dealer in autographs and manuscripts, Toronto Villa, Torriano Avenue, London, N.W. My friend Mr. Wolcott of Concord was passing through London at the time, and he volunteered to accompany me to the Anderson place. We concluded, however, that the dealers might be timid if we both appeared, so one of us remained near by. The people at this address said they knew the lady who had the letters to sell, and she would call on me. My address in Bedford Park was given, and it was promised that she would call next day, Monday. The woman duly came. My wife and I, fearing that any effort to put the law in motion might cause the destruction of the letters, resolved on strategy. The woman was middle-aged, crafty, and very timorous. Her story that Carlyle had given the letters to a friend, etc., I accepted without hesitation. As she had come all the way from Kentish Town to Bedford Park, my wife hastened to refresh her with tea and treated her like a lady. Finding that she had brought only 4 of the letters, I agreed to her price, £10 for the 4, on condition that next day I might bring them to her and examine others until I could select the 4 preferred. She chose, however, to bring the rest herself, and did so, fortunately on a day when we had guests and when it was necessary for her to leave them for examination during the evening. The first 4 left had of course been copied, and those she took back. My wife and I sat during the entire night copying the rest. The address left by the woman was the same as that where I had been offered the Carlyle manuscript. Having lost her timidity, the woman seemed to enjoy the negotiation. My wife gave her cake and sherry. I agreed to take an additional letter, and possibly others, if she would bring all she had and let me keep them overnight, and in that way we discovered she had 27. Having closely verified our copies and posted them, registered, to Professor Norton, I at once unfolded the whole matter to Sir James Stephen, co-executor with Froude of Carlyle's papers. It was talked over, November 20, 1882, in a long walk, and I received from Sir James the next morning the following letter. I always like to put in writing the substance of anything of importance which I may have said, as it saves mistakes and misunderstandings. I write accordingly to remind you of what passed between us this afternoon. You told me that there had been a correspondence between Mr. Carlyle and Mr. Emerson for many years, that Mr. Carlyle in 1875 wrote a letter to Mr. Emerson's daughter, of which you showed me a copy, saying amongst other things that he wished Mr. Emerson's letters to be given to Mr. Emerson's family after his, Mr. Carlyle's, death. You added that Mr. Froude had accordingly asked Mrs. Mary Carlyle to return Mr. Emerson's letters to his family, and that she, and I think you said Mr. Froude, had accordingly returned all they had, being only 3 or 4. You further told me that the rest of Mr. Emerson's letters, 26 in number, had been ascertained by you to be in the hands of certain persons in London who are dealers in autographs, and who professed to have received them from Mr. Ballantyne, a publisher, who they said got them from Mr. Neuberg, who had at one time acted as secretary to Mr. Carlyle. This account was inconsistent with Mr. Carlyle's letter, which implied that he either had or believed himself to have possession of the letters in 1875, some years after Mr. Neuberg's death. Lastly, you told me that you had found means to procure copies of these letters, which you had forwarded to Mr. Charles Norton, who you said is about to publish them, together with Mr. Carlyle's letters, which had been carefully preserved by Mr. Emerson. Having thought over these matters, you asked me both as one of Mr. Carlyle's executors and as a lawyer what I thought of the matter. I replied that in my opinion Mr. Emerson's letters to Mr. Carlyle were the property of Mr. Carlyle's personal representatives, but subject to the right of Mr. Emerson's personal representatives to prevent their publication, and that if you were right in supposing that the letters had got into the hands of the present possessors by fraudulent means, that property still subsisted. I further said, however, that in the circumstances you stated it would in my opinion be difficult for Mr. Carlyle's executors to establish their legal right to the letters, and to gain possession of them by summary means, though I considered it not improbable that something might be done towards inducing them to give the letters up. I further said that in my character as one of Mr. Carlyle's executors, I had no sort of objection to the publication of the letters by Mr. Norton, and that as far as I was concerned as executor, I had only to thank you for what you had done in the matter. I said finally that if the Emerson family wished to recover the letters from their present possessors, I should be glad to serve them. I think I went so far as to say I should have no objection to allow them to sue in my name, but if I did I ought not to have said so. I do not think I ought to say any more than that if they show a strong wish upon the subject to recover the originals, I should be disposed to help them, but I should not be disposed to allow my name to be used, or to advise Mr. Froude to allow his name to be used, unless evidence of our title to the letters, fully satisfactory to me in a legal point of view, were forthcoming, and of course upon the usual terms as to indemnity against all costs. I have written this in order to prevent all possible mistakes, and to serve as a memorandum. In answer I wrote to Sir James, November 22nd. I have received yours of the 20th, and shall forward a copy of it to Mrs. Forbes by tomorrow's mail. Neuberg died in 1867. Mrs. Mary Carlyle wrote me, August 12, concerning the letters forwarded last year. I received this packet from Mr. Froude for the purpose. I did not examine it, but dispatched it as I received it. I did not mean to convey the impression you have received that there were only 3 or 4 letters so forwarded. There must have been many more. But there were 34 letters and 1 document missing. These were offered for sale at 5 places known to me. Among these letters are, or were when I saw them, 2 from Jane Welsh to Thomas Carlyle. Mrs. Forbes writes me that these letters from her father are mentioned in Carlyle's will. The woman with whom I dealt for the letters did not to me name Mr. Neuberg first. She said the letters had been given by Carlyle to his secretary, who helped him on his books. I suggested Neuberg, and she said she thought that was the name. The editor of the Athenaeum told me that when the letters were offered to him the same history was given of them as that Mr. Froude has given of the Irish Diary in his preface. This is the Neuberg-Ballantyne story. When I parted with Sir James Stephen on the 20th, he said he was going to Froude's house, and I was not surprised by his letter. Poor Froude was in a sad tangle already about the Carlyle business. My own relations with him, which for 18 years had been intimate, had become strained, and it was on that account that I had resorted to Sir James. I felt sure that Froude would not touch any new complication. He may, however, have called to account the fraudulent amanuensis who deceived him in the matter of the Irish Diary, for I think the Ring became suspicious of me. When I presently made an effort to negotiate for the remaining originals of the letters, it was replied that they were all sold. Perhaps, however, it was true. A few months later a young Emersonian at Cambridge, England, wrote to me of his joy in having obtained a letter of Emerson to Carlyle. At my request he sent me its date, and I had to tell him it was one of the stolen letters and should be sent to Mrs. Forbes. He wrote back with much agitation, but the letter was never forwarded. Alexander Ireland printed one of the letters in his book on Emerson, but it was one I had been able to supply to Norton from a copy Carlyle allowed me to make, and Mrs. Forbes concluded not to disturb her father's old friend by asking for it. On April 11, 1893, 4 letters of Emerson to Carlyle were sold at auction, Sotheby's, for £12 15s, of which 3 were among those I had copied for Norton. These letters were from the collection of Mr. T. G. Arthur of Glasgow. The Ring had also transferred its operations to New York, where the Tribune published 4 of the letters. Little by little Mrs. W. H. Forbes obtained a large number of her father's letters. My friend Charles Norton wished to dwell largely on this story in the introduction to his volume, but I advised him not to do so lest it should excite the suspicion of the Ring and prevent me from procuring originals for Mrs. Forbes. So he contented himself with expressing in the preface his gratitude for my having obtained the letters which had fallen into strange hands. Chapter 50. Chapter 51, Part 1 of Autobiography, Memories and Experiences, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Arlene Stebbins. Autobiography, Memories and Experiences, Volume 2 by Moncure Conway. Chapter 51, Part 1. Weary reader of a way-worn autobiographer, clasp my hand. We draw near to our place of parting, not because my story is all told, but because it can be told no farther than in the detached memoranda of this final chapter, for it must be a sort of omnibus chapter, in which are to be crowded as many as its limited capacity can carry of memory's latest passengers. They must find places as they can, and alas, how many are left behind altogether. In the autumn of 1882, while on a visit to Rose Hill, Coventry, I had some conversation with Miss Sarah Hennell, author of Thoughts in Aid of Faith, concerning her lifelong friend George Eliot. We went over to Birdgrove, where George Eliot's girlhood and youth were passed, and in the unoccupied house I submitted to her my theory. George Eliot had grown up mentally at a time when marriage was clerical and connected with the subjection of women to an extent that lost it the reverence of progressive thinkers. But after her irregular union with Lewis, the laws were reformed and her position was unhappy. Young ladies were, however, able to quote her example. Under these circumstances, after Lewis's death, she married Mr. Cross in a fashionable church with almost ostentatious clerical solemnities, for the express purpose of avowing her mistake in the Lewis union and reversing her example. Sarah Hennell said in substance, I wrote my notes next day, Marian Evans was in youth morbidly pious. She was melancholy by temperament, and often in tears. She suffered from loneliness. The first thing she wrote was a review of Froude's Nemesis of Faith in a Coventry paper. It fell into Froude's hands, and he came from London to see her. My sister and Mr. Bray and I were arranging a tour in Switzerland, Marian Evans with us, and Froude intended to go with us, but at the railway station a note came saying he was on the point of being married and could not come. I probably spoke to Sarah Hennell of the possible bearing of the Nemesis of Faith, wherein a wife meeting one she loves regards her legitimate marriage as a sort of adultery, on George Eliot's union with Lewis. We all regarded this union as a calamity, said Sarah Hennell. Mr. Bray regarded it as due to her defective self-esteem and self-reliance, and her sufferings from loneliness. She continued to suffer from loneliness, but came to love the characters in her books as if they were her children. She loved them even when they were wicked. Once, when I was at her house in London, looking at some sketches from Romola, we paused before Tito. After a moment's silence, George Eliot said softly, as if to herself, "The dear fellow." I exclaimed, "He's not a dear fellow at all, but a very bad fellow." "Ah," she said, "I was seeing him with the eyes of Romola." After the theological and ecclesiastical anarchy that set in after the Tractarian movement at Oxford, there were many indications of a moral revolt, for the most part theoretical, resembling that which followed the fall of Roman Catholicism at Geneva, which Calvin crushed by beheading brilliant Jacques Gruet. The Nemesis of Faith was one sign of it, and Hawthorne's Scarlet Letter was a reflection of it. The effort of Swinburne to revive it in England by his audacious poems was suppressed somewhat in Calvin's way. His head was metaphorically cut off. He did indeed write some brilliant poems after that, notably his Songs Before Sunrise, but for his wonderful genius they were songs of an afterglow. I used to see a good deal of Swinburne in the time of his controversy with the Philistines, and, being a born lover of liberty, held in horror the conspiracy of critics to repress his genius. His poem addressed to Walt Whitman in America affected me as a plaintive swan song. Walt Whitman took it rather too much as a laudation of himself. Swinburne was really attracted mainly by his audacity. He wrote me a long letter about Whitman, but has requested me not to print it, and I agree with him that it would misrepresent his maturer thought. In 1883 and 4 I made a voyage around the world, studying especially the various religions of mankind: Buddhism, Brahmanism, Parsaism, Jainism, Islam, Brahmoism, Theosophy, Mormonism, and other movements. My observations and adventures during this journey, when fully written, proved to be a record too extensive for inclusion in the present work. It amounts indeed to a volume, and must await its time to see the light. Now, at the age of 52, I desired to leave the pulpit. I had been in that kind of work since I was 19. My 21 years at South Place Chapel had enabled me to deliver my religious and ethical convictions with a certain completeness, and I had several works in view that demanded literary leisure. So we sold our house in Bedford Park, and on July 27 the last of my 7 farewell discourses, published in 1884, was given. The last months of 1884 we gave to Berlin, where we saw something of the Webers and Bunсens and other learned men, and joined in the homage to the historian von Ranke on his 90th birthday. His English daughter-in-law enabled us to converse pleasantly with the charming old man, whose mind was clear. A herald announced the approach of the young princes, and the company ranged themselves close to the walls while the royal youths handed large white bouquets to the author. Our particular friends in Berlin were Hermann Grimm and his wife, daughter of Goethe's Bettine. Hermann Grimm, endeared to all lovers of Emerson by his exquisite essay on his works, was the most attractive gentleman we knew in Berlin. We were invited every Sunday evening to his house, but I lost this friend by a single sentence in The Wandering Jew, which I presented to him. Writing in 1880 during an outbreak of Judenhetze in Germany, I said, "The retention of the Reverend Mr. Stalker as court chaplain while he is leading this agitation so unscrupulously is a confession that the anti-Semitic movement has the encouragement of the Emperor and his Chancellor." So we saw the Grimms no more. A mutual friend told me that Hermann Grimm had no sympathy with the Judenhetze nor with Stalker, but that he could not tolerate a word that might reflect on the Emperor. Bismarck in the Reichstag impressed me as a finer parliamentary leader than either Gladstone or Beaconsfield. There was a simplicity in his art, an air of deference in his force, and a repose in his manner which added moral dignity to his fine physical presence. One day a radical member made a fierce and at times insulting attack on the government. Bismarck in his reply made only a brief passing allusion to the personalities, saying, "We also are capable of such feelings, and if we do not express them, it is for the sake of good manners." What could be more neat? The Honorable Alphonso Taft and his family had been members of my church in Cincinnati, and our friendship with them had continued for 27 years. Judge Taft having become minister to Russia, we were invited to visit them in St. Petersburg. The weeks we passed there were always memorable to us. We were entertained by the Tsar and Tsarina, who spoke English, she fluently, and met the diplomatic people. It was especially useful to me to converse confidentially about Russia with so exact and thoroughly informed a lawyer as Judge Taft. When we worked together in our church in Cincinnati, the Jews were friendly to our society, the rabbis Wise and Lilienthal paying me much attention, and the reputation of Russia for hostility to that race troubled me. It so happened that Minister Taft was just concluding his interviews with the government on 2 cases of Russian Jews naturalized in the United States who were desirous of securing permits of residence which would enable them to enter Russia. By Russian law no native could leave the country without official permission, and those who had gone without such permission were liable to arrest on their return. This law was applicable to all races, but the discrimination concerning the Jews was that the law prohibited their coming in any case to Odessa and a few other localities. The right of Russia to pass such laws could not be questioned, the minister said, there being nothing inconsistent with them in any treaty. And as for the apparent animus against Jews, he said that after many conversations with the Tsar and his ministers, he was satisfied that no one in the government had the least ill feeling toward that people. There was no discrimination against Jews in St. Petersburg or in Moscow. Russia has built many colleges for them in various cities. But in certain remote places it had been found that a fanatical prejudice and hatred lingered, which the coming of a new Jew might fan into unmanageable flame, dangerous not to one, but to all Jews. The restrictions are therefore for the security of the Jews. The government cannot distribute military companies in all these distant regions to manage mobs. Observing the adoration of the Holy Bambino in the Araceli Church, Rome, the infant Jesus carved from a tree on the Mount of Olives, painted by St. Luke and decorated by popes and princes, the doll with its staring eyes faced me with a tu quoque. I, too, had all my life been decorating one Bambino after another. The Messiah, the Redeemer, the Prophet, the Martyr, the typical man, the Reformer, the altruist, the free-thinking teacher. Strauss's declaration that the man, once merged in a god, is irrecoverably lost, seemed to me justified by all the modern lives of Jesus, including that of Renan. It was surprising to find Renan accepting so many incidents related of Jesus in versions that make them inconsistent with his own portraiture, such as the attack on the money-changers. Un jour même, dit-on, la colère l'emporta, il frappa à coups de fouet ces ignobles vendeurs et renversa leur table. En général, il aimait peu le temple. If he cared little for the temple, why be so violent with the sacristans, fulfilling their functions, as Renan says? Professor Noyes was careful to point out to us at Cambridge that a right interpretation of the story in John showed that the whip was used solely to drive out the sheep and the oxen. Unfortunately, Dr. Noyes did not recognize that the violence to the money-changers was imported clumsily from the synoptics into the text of the fourth Gospel, where it was really written, "He made a whip of small cords, and drove out of the temple court the sheep and oxen, and to those that sold doves he said, Remove them." In all my pleadings against war, since my 19th year, I have found its chief entrenchment among Christians to be that scourge of Jesus in the temple. The Prince of Peace was always accommodated to that assault, and I have no doubt that the supposed incident has been the chief consecration of bloodshed. Being myself long convinced that the thing was incredible, it appeared to me comic at the Oberammergau Passion Play, 1871, that the money-changers should receive their blows submissively from a man they could easily have arrested. But in 1879 Dr. Nicholson, afterwards Bodleian librarian at Oxford, sent me sheets of his Gospel According to the Hebrews, and in it I noticed a saying of Jesus preserved from that lost Gospel by Epiphanius. And they, Ebionites, say that he, Jesus, both came and, as their so-called Gospel has it, instructed them that he had come to destroy the sacrifices, and said, Unless ye cease from sacrificing, the wrath will not cease from you. The wrath, hearge, is a personification. All sacrifice is devil worship, but to end sacrifices altogether was to destroy the last remnant of priestly support and authority. Here, then, for the first time I discovered a sufficient cause for the execution of Jesus. He might have repeated the disparagements of sacrifice contained in several psalms and prophetic books, but the very efforts of the early Christians, themselves adhering to the principle of sacrifice, to turn this temple incident into an attack on merchants and zeal for the temple, proved to me that they would not have entirely invented it. The young genius had gathered around him a large crowd of anti-sacrifice reformers, too numerous for the temple police to resist, and driven the sacrificial animals out of the temple courtyard bazaar. Such is the outcome of reforming zeal. Zoroaster declares an eternal war between the good mind and the evil mind, and Parsi theology comes to derive both as twins from one mind anterior to both. Buddha says there are no gods and is himself made a god. Jesus denounces sacrifice and is himself made the supreme sacrifice. When I made this discovery, my ministry had closed. What a source of light it would have been to me had I been taught that at Harvard Divinity School. I have tried to impress it on liberal teachers, but generally they cling to their bambino, the humanitarian teacher, and the freethinkers who do not believe any human Jesus existed have a bambino of their own, some Krishna Christos or solar form. No doubt they will mostly consider my anti-sacrifice enthusiast merely my ninth bambino, and practically that is of little importance, but it is of serious importance that the Christian clergy should sacrifice to the letter of Scripture the character of Jesus. A violent attack on men engaged in selling sacrificial animals at a temple door would be as immoral, intolerant, and brutal as a similar attack today on those who sell tracts in a church vestibule, or the vendors of candles to burn before holy pictures. To scatter their money would be robbery. To drive cattle out of the temple precincts may have been lawful, and at any rate it is not inconsistent with generous sentiments. In witnessing the Passion Play again, I remarked more than on the former occasion the absence from the drama of any real motive for putting Jesus to death. Humanly speaking, it laid upon the Jews the crime of killing an innocent man through diabolical hatred of his excellence and wisdom, and at the same time showed that they could not help themselves, the whole thing being divinely ordained for the salvation of mankind. End of chapter 51, Part 1. Chapter 51, Part 2 of Autobiography, Memories, and Experiences, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Arlene Stebbins. Autobiography, Memories, and Experiences, Volume 2, by Moncure Conway. Chapter 51, Part 2. On our return to America, 1885, I went with my entire family to visit my parents in Fredericksburg, Virginia, who resided with their youngest son Peter and his family. My other brother Richard came from his farm in Orange County, and our sister Mrs. F. A. March from Easton, and for the first time we had a family reunion. For the first time, too, I had opportunity to make some careful investigations into the history of our region where the Washingtons lived. But my most entertaining search was one described in Harper's Magazine, January 1886, under the title, "Hunting a Mythical Pall-Bearer." For 20 years following the war there had appeared in the American and European press an alleged epitaph in Fredericksburg of one Edmund Holder, in which it was said that he had been a pall-bearer of William Shakespeare. I had credited the story in 1865 when in England, had discovered that it was a myth in 1875 when visiting Fredericksburg, but now in 1885 determined to find out the origin of the myth. My aged mother remembered that in her girlhood, when driving with her father near Potomac Church, over 5 miles away, her father stopped and wrote down the inscription on a lonely tombstone. Her half-brother, Dr. J. H. Daniel, remembered the stone, and that it bore the name of an English surgeon. This word was in the mythical Shakespeare epitaph. In company with a lawyer, St. George Fitzhugh, I started out for that region and discovered a sunken grave, very old, from which a stone might have been removed. About 200 yards away we saw a cabin and found there a poor widow, Mrs. Alexander, a name once grand in Virginia. She needed a large stone for the back of her fireplace, and a neighbor brought her this gravestone. She did not use it because a tombstone was sacred, and it was set out of doors against the chimney. A few weeks before our visit her chimney had fallen and covered the old stone with débris. She remembered that the name on it was Helder, and 16 was in the year of his death. St. George Fitzhugh and myself cleared away the débris and found the stone blackened and broken, with the letters H.E. and part of the R in the opening HERE. A week later I learned that the original inscription had been copied for its curious lettering by a New Hampshire soldier, C.J. Brown, during the war, who sent me his copy. There was no white settlement in northern Virginia in 1618, and no doubt Dr. Helder died while on some exploring expedition. The foot-square stone with 2 letters on it, now in my brother's house in Fredericksburg, is a fragment of the oldest tombstone of an Englishman in America. There was a family of elders in that region, one of whom was a fine portrait painter in Fredericksburg. It occurred to me that a tale might be written on the subject, and the result was my little novel Prisons of Air. But a droll fate befell it. After making a first draft of it, I concluded to submit that to a publisher, and if he liked the plot, to write it in a full and finished way. Being much occupied with a centennial work, I almost forgot the novel, until one day I received a letter from a Moncure relative in Paris, Madame du Bellay, thanking me for the pleasure she had received from my Prisons of Air. Much shocked at this, I wrote to the John W. Lovell Company, to whom for some reason I had submitted it, and discovered that the book had been published several months. They supposed it complete, and believing I was in Europe, did not know where to send the proof, and thus my tale, of which I could have made something, was thrust in mere blocked-out condition on the public. A beautiful welcome awaited us on our return to dwell in our native land. I was invited by eminent citizens of New York to give a course of lectures in the University Club, and was fairly feted by old friends. In order that our 2 sons, already in New York, might be with us, we desired a large house, and found one in Clark Street, Brooklyn, No. 62, not far from my old friends Gordon L. Ford and his family on one side, and Henry Ward Beecher on the other. In the early summer we went to the new seaside village of Wianno, where many of our friends had cottages, and where all the fairies were dancing, and the naiads swimming. My wife fell in love with Wianno, and I presented her with a cottage there, which she named Pine and Palm, the title of my first novel, which Henry Holt and Company published in New York. Just as my story of Southern life was published, appeared a romance by another Virginian, the story of Don Miff by Virginia Stabney. On inquiry I learned that he was residing in New York. The book filled me with delight, and I hastened to make his acquaintance. He was a very brilliant man, and I feel certain he would have had a notable literary career but for his premature death. My Pine and Palm had a fine success in England, but Virginia Stabney and myself both found that the American people could see no picturesqueness in the Old South, and were rather irritated by attempts to revive the subject. My Virginia cousin, Lucy Daniel Conway, wrote a tale which I thought powerful when I read it in manuscript, but it has never been published, and I suppose she also found publishers not attracted by pictures of antebellum Southern life. Mr. Kingdon Conway, an English gentleman, and husband of Cousin Lucy, called on me in Brooklyn, and left me with a parcel of documents relating to his wife's great-grandfather, Governor Edmund Randolph, the first Attorney General, and second Secretary of State. I never before realized that dear Aunt Lucy, wife of Justice Daniel, was a daughter of Edmund Randolph. I then made the discovery that Edmund Randolph had suffered the most shocking injustice. I set about writing an article on the subject, but on finding that my friends, the Maguires in Washington, possessed a large number of unpublished letters of Randolph, I undertook the larger work, Omitted Chapters of History, disclosed in the Life and Papers of Edmund Randolph. At the Harvard commencement in 1886 I gave the annual address to the graduates of the Divinity School, my theme being the new incarnation of religion which I recognized in the humanitarian tendencies of all churches. In November of that year we were overwhelmed by the death of our younger son Dana. who was just completing his scientific studies in Columbia University. He was the darling of his brother and sister, as well as of his parents, and the bereavement was terrible. We could not bear to live in the Brooklyn house, and I purchased an apartment in New York. Before entering it, my wife and I made a short visit to Boston, where Dr. O.W. Holmes called on us. He had shortly before lost a son by the same disease, typhoid, and in trying to console us, broke down and mingled his sobs with ours. It was fortunate for me that I had on hand the work on Edmund Randolph. To this I gave much time and toil, visiting Washington, Richmond, Charlottesville, and the chief historical societies of the country. The work elicited fine reviews and articles and brought me many grateful letters from publicists, yet it never paid the publisher's expenses, and of course not one penny did it bring me. I have often had reason to recall a remark I once heard from Mr. Lecky, that mankind are largely swayed by historical personages who never existed. If any man wishes to preserve his faith in our political gods, let him not search into the truth of American history. Very few of them, a braver man might say none, can bear the microscope found in his own correspondence without some smokiness in his halo, and the diabolical horns of the defamed, such as Tom Paine, General Gates, Aaron Burr, are transmuted by unbiased investigation into halos quite as pure as those of the political gods. When I was writing the life of Edmund Randolph, I talked over with George Bancroft the charges secretly made by Timothy Pickering against Randolph, then Secretary of State, on the basis of an intercepted letter written by the French envoy Fauché, obtained from the British minister Hammond. Pickering showed Washington a translation made by himself containing a mistranslation damaging to Randolph. Bancroft said, "It is certain that the charges made against Randolph were untrue, and it would no doubt be made clear if all of the intercepted letters of Fauché could be found." Hammond selected only one from the package to be shown to Washington. My dear friend Samuel Fenton in London explored the British Foreign Office archives for those intercepted dispatches, but they were not there. I found 3 of them in the Pickering papers in the Massachusetts Historical Society, and my friend John Durand in Paris discovered there an intercepted dispatch showing the charges groundless. But it was not until after my Randolph book was published that in examining the Pickering MSS for another purpose, I came upon one of the intercepted Fauché dispatches, which, had it been revealed at the time to Washington, would have overwhelmed the intrigue against Randolph. This dispatch was bound far away from all other papers and dispatches relating to the Randolph-Fauché case. It had thus escaped my attention, and no doubt that of the Honorable Robert C. Winthrop. Mr. Winthrop, in an oration on Washington many years before, had spoken disparagingly of Randolph, but interested himself to secure for me freedom to use the Pickering MSS. There is no reason to doubt the statement attached to this Fauché dispatch that it was loaned him, Pickering, by Minister Liston, successor of Hammond, and as this was some years after the Randolph affair, the document might easily get among the papers of another year, and so bound up by the Historical Society. It remained true, however, that Pickering, after supplanting Randolph as Secretary of State, had in his hands a document which would have entirely relieved his predecessor while alive from disgrace. So is history made. In a list of debtors to the United States laid before Congress in 1887, a balance of $61,855.07 stands against Randolph. In talking of this with Randolph's grandson, the late P.V. Daniel, Jr. of Richmond, he assured me that Peter Washington, while in the Treasury, had shown him all the accounts with Randolph, proving that he owed nothing. After being twice told at the Treasury that no such accounts existed, an accountant there, Mr. Garrison of Virginia, hearing what P.V. Daniel, Jr. had said, searched them out. They proved that instead of Randolph's owing the United States anything, the government owes his heirs $7,716.61. Before my book appeared, I printed the facts in the New York Evening Post. On this, my relative, Senator Daniel of Virginia, induced the Senate to order a report on the Randolph accounts. The report was made. Some years ago it occurred to me to inquire of the Comptroller of the Treasury if the old entry of the Randolph debt had been cancelled. Nothing of the kind. It was contrary to Treasury usage to correct anything transmitted from the past. The utmost that I could secure was a promise that beside the fictitious debt entry should be written a reference to the report of January 1889. There is no other intimation of the erroneous character of the entry. I think it was in 1888 that Sir Edwin Arnold visited New York. He fell ill in his hotel, and Mr. and Mrs. Andrew Carnegie took him to their house. After his recovery they invited a number of literary people to dine with him. After the ladies had withdrawn, the conversation fell on the question of retaining Latin and Greek in the normal college course. Sir Edwin argued warmly that the retention was essential to the preservation of the elegant and beautiful style acquired by English writers at Oxford and Cambridge. Andrew Carnegie thereon broke out with a vehement protest against the absurdity of occupying the best years of youth with dead tongues. Shakespeare knew small Latin and less Greek. He and Burns wrote well enough without it, and Carnegie prophetically declared that the great world growing around these cultivators of classicism was steadily ignoring their existence. The writers listened to were dealing more and more with things, with realities, not with neat phrases and words. I knew but little of Andrew Carnegie, but being substantially on his side was impressed by his vigor, even eloquence at times, and thought to myself that had Carlyle been present, he would have taken his hand. Arnold, however, was not happy during the rest of the evening. I do not believe that any very rich man ever lived before him with so much and such genuine enthusiasm for literature as Andrew Carnegie. In returning to America, it was among my hopes to renew some intimate friendships of my youth. Helen Jackson, among the earliest of these, whom publishers had persuaded against her will to adhere to her literary signature H. H. adopted while she was still Mrs. Hunt, wrote me, 1879, a discouraging account of the conditions of literature in America. There is nothing in America to give you an equivalent for what you would give up in London. There is no such thing here, it seems to me, as a literary class. I doubt if there ever will be. It is because our literary men are not great enough, nor numerous enough to create a class, but still more because money is the national gauge of power. I believe if you got at the truth of the inmost feeling of 99 men out of 100 in what are called the financial circles of America, it would be found to be 8/10 contempt for literary people, 1/10 pity, and 1/10 respect. They think it is well to have a Longfellow and a Whittier, and a few more like them, because other countries have authors, a thing no country should be without. But for anything beyond that, no. Their only feeling about literature is that it is an uncommonly poor way of making a living. If they had to take their choice between being Mrs. Southworth and Hawthorne, they would be Mrs. S., unhesitatingly. She has written 59 novels and made a fortune. That is worth while. When Helen came through London in 1869, my wife and I called on her in her lodgings, and soon after she wrote to Mrs. Conway, "Will you not come and see me some day without Monk? I want to know you, if you will let me." Wife, who had never seen Helen in America, was of course captivated by her, and so were our literary friends whom we invited to meet her at dinner. In 1880 we had her in our house at Bedford Park for nearly a week, and in 1884 should probably have accepted the invitation of Mr. Jackson and herself to visit their unique home at Colorado Springs, but for the accident that befell her June 28th. She wrote to me merrily about her shortened leg and crutches in October, but in the summer following we could only send messages of love and grief to be read as her eyes were closing in death, August 11, 1885. I was astonished, in reading obituary notices of Helen Jackson, to observe that none ascribed to her the famous Saxe Holm stories in any decisive way. Soon after they began to appear she told me that she wrote them, but begged me not to betray her secret during her life. I regarded the secrecy as a caprice, but told her I would keep it, though I would not positively deny her authorship. This was in the summer of 1875, when I met Helen in New York. In November, when I was lecturing in Chicago, I was entertained in the house of Mr. and Mrs. Lewis, who assured me that the Saxe Holm stories were written by a friend of theirs in that city, who was the friend also of Mrs. Celia Burleigh, whom I knew. It occurred to me that Helen, in order to give her denial of the authorship technical veracity, had persuaded some friend to write some pages of the work, and wrote to her what Mrs. Lewis had said. In reply she wrote to me the subjoined letter, dated at Colorado Springs, November 16, 1875. Dear Monk, I'm glad even of a lie which made you write to me. The history of the false claimants to the S.H. stories is long and amusing. When you are in New York, go and talk with Gilder about it. There is another young woman in New York who swears she wrote them, and her patron and friend, a worthy jeweller in the Bowery, has been to Scribner's and pressed her claim, and actually carried them another story to prove her to be the author. Of course the story was trash, even worse, for it was full of misspelling and bad grammar, but her friend still believes her. Why, he says, I've known her for years and years. She's the next best woman to my wife. This woman whom you have just run against in Chicago must be an audacious creature, for a long time ago, 2 years or thereabouts, Celia Burleigh published a letter in the Woman's Journal setting forth her claim, and I wrote to Celia Burleigh, signing myself S.H. and sending the letter through Scribner's, accompanied by a note from Mr. Seymour, guaranteeing the genuineness of the S.H. signature. I begged Mrs. Burleigh not to allow her friend to persist any longer in a deception which must sooner or later cover her with disgrace, etc. The letter, accompanied as it was by a note from the Saxe Holm publishers, could not have failed to convince Mrs. Burleigh. Whether she had the moral courage to let her friend know of it, I cannot be sure, but I think she would. I asked her to acknowledge the receipt of the letter, writing to S.H. in care of Scribner's, but she never did. Possibly she never received it. Last autumn a Mrs. Catherine Gray of Pennsylvania wrote a letter to the Commonwealth, making the same claim for a friend of hers. I wrote as before, but had no answer. Colonel Higginson says I shall get into trouble some day, as I have so positively denied the authorship, but I think not, because I intend to deny it till I die. Then I wish it to be known. He is really the only man who can swear I wrote them. He read the first 3 or 4, page by page, as I wrote them. Mr. Jackson can swear to Four-leaved Clover and Tourmaline, for I read those to him page by page as I wrote them out here, and I am going to get to work on another as soon as we are established in our home. It will be either The Lady of Ensworth County or Mercy Philbrick's Choice. Now you can say to the Lewises every word of this except my name. That you must withhold. All goes well, and 3 times well. I am profoundly glad. I believe the best part of my life lies before me, even now, if only I can be well and strong. I have only one regret, that is, that I did not see 2 years ago that this thing was best and right. I wish from the bottom of my heart you could see Mr. Jackson. I believe you would recognize him, and be glad for me. Think what it would be now, to come and stay once more under my roof, and drive with me through the garden of the gods. I don't believe there is anything in Egypt so solemn or so grand as these red sandstone towers here. I have a paper in the next Atlantic. You must read A Symphony in Yellow and Red. It is a feeble word for the Colorado colony. Now, write again and say that you do not believe I am S.H. at all. I wrote to the Chicago family, but cannot remember any reply, and indeed it was absurd to expect people to denounce an acquaintance as an impostor for claiming the authorship of a work on the accusation of an anonymous person, supported only by a conceivably interested publisher. On December 15, Helen wrote again urging me to give my lectures at Denver and visit them, and incidentally asked if I received her long letter setting forth how I really did write every word of the Saxe Holm stories, and interesting facts relative to the claimants. In a letter of January 14, 1877, Helen wrote me about her novel, Mercy Philbrick's Choice, in a way that revealed such sensitiveness to criticism that I better understood her anxiety to conceal her authorship. I am quite at sea about the book, and feel, I must say, less heart to write another than I wish I did. I honestly tried my best to write a good story. I honestly thought it was a fairly good work. But the Saturday Review, the Nation, the literary world, all abuse it. Of course there has been a great wave of adulation, but from inferior sources. Warner and Curtis are the only men of standing who have praised it, and I have an unfortunate but unconquerable tendency always to doubt the praise and believe the blame. I saw it quoted from a letter of yours somewhere that it was the cleverest book recently printed in America, and that gave me pleasure. And Hattie Preston wrote a positive panegyric on the book's style and quality for the Atlantic, and Howells accepted it, but it does not appear, and I think it will not. Meantime the story sells steadily. It is now in its 8,000. I have had great fun in discussing it, having intimate friends say, "What utter trash! Don't you think so?" I think it is not all universal, the notion that I wrote it. The new Saxe Holm, a short one, which begins the next Scribner, will probably give rise to more interesting discussions and wise sayings. You will see that plenty of critics will say, "Now it is made plain that Saxe Holm was not the author of Mercy Philbrick's Choice. Nothing could be more unlike this story and that," etc. Nothing could, that is sure, and the short story is the best. Perhaps I can't write a long story, but I mean to try once more. Colonel Higginson said of Mercy, "It is much stronger than any of the Saxe Holms, and far better written." Helen in these tales and in her poems could not get her intimate friends out of her mind. She wrote for them, and received their praise. She wished to find out how they would impress persons who had no personal knowledge of her, or even whether the author was man or woman. Hence the secrecy to be removed after her death. Then I wish it to be known. End of chapter 51, part 2. Chapter 51, Part 3 of Autobiography, Memoirs and Experiences, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Arlene Stebbins. Autobiography, Memories and Experiences, Volume 2 by Moncure Conway, Chapter 51, Part 3. Soon after undertaking the life of Thomas Paine, I found that it was a large and arduous task. The anathema on him had been the means of burying masses of important facts. He was the most competent and veracious witness to the events of the revolutionary epoch of the 18th century, in America, England, and France, and his testimony had been suppressed or ignored by historians because he wrote The Age of Reason. It was necessary to revise the history of the three nations between 1774 and 1800 in the light of Paine's letters and writings published and unpublished. Having explored the American archives, I resolved to follow the tracks of Paine in Europe. This purpose was delayed by a demand from Professor Eric Robertson to write the life of Hawthorne for the Great Writers series he was editing for Walter Scott. The writing of this work was a delight from first to last. In the great centennial year of 1889, when I acted on the Committee for Washington Family Portraits in New York and wrote historical articles, I was conscious the while that no president that ever lived interested me so much as Nathaniel Hawthorne. I discovered a Hawthorne enthusiast in Mr. G. M. Williamson, then of Brooklyn, who took me out to his house, where he and his gracious wife entertained me 2 days while I explored the MSS referred to in my volume. In the spring I went with my wife and daughter on a sort of Hawthorne pilgrimage, to Salem, Brook Farm, Concord, talking with all who remained of Hawthorne's friends, especially with his wife's sister Elizabeth Peabody, and with Dr. Holmes and Wentworth Higginson. Then I began the work at our Pine and Palm Cottage, Wiano, Cape Cod. In October 1889 we sailed for France, and after seeing the exposition went on to Rome. In the Continental Hotel, where I had a good room for writing, I had the fortune to find the particular old friend who could be most helpful to me, Dr. George B. Loring of Salem, then U.S. Minister to Portugal. He had known Hawthorne all his life, had thoroughly studied him, and was glad to give me his recollections. In the same hotel Dr. George Bird of London was passing the winter. He was a near friend of Dante Rossetti and an expert art critic. He entered with eagerness into my plan of visiting every work of art in Rome mentioned by Hawthorne in The Marble Faun and in his notebooks. So, with Mr. and Mrs. W. W. Story at hand, and the Stillmans, and the Dufferins at the British Embassy, I could hardly have been better situated for writing about Hawthorne. When I was called on to give a public lecture on Hawthorne in Rome, most of the large audience must have felt that they had helped me to prepare the piece, especially the Countess Maron, owner of Hilda's Tower, and Lady Victoria, youngest daughter of Lord Dufferin, and Ava, who guided me about and was the sweetest of interpreters. It was she who went with me to see the Tarpeian Rock, and asked the custodian to show us the exact spot where the Capuchin fell and was killed. "There's the place," answered the Italian woman, "but he was not killed at all. The papers said so, but he was taken to the hospital and is now quite well." While in Rome I was called on to give another public address. It was on Robert Browning, tidings of whose death reached us. W. W. Story and his wife were as deeply moved as myself by this event. Story said to me, "The last time I saw him was here in Rome. He was just driving off to the station, but stopped his voiture and looked out. I went to him, and he placed his hands on my shoulders and said, 40 years of unbroken friendship.' That was all. I could not speak, and he drove on." While writing the Life of Hawthorne, published in 1890, I had friends and agents in both America and England ferreting out for me every letter and relic and old edition of Thomas Paine. On arriving in England the same year, I visited every spot in the country associated with Paine, as indeed I had done in America and Paris. The 2 volumes of Paine's life and 4 volumes of his writings occupied the greater part of 5 years. In 1892 my old congregation urged such reasons for my resuming my ministry there that I had to consent to give them discourses for a time, and in 1893 wrote the centenary history of South Place Chapel, which in 1793 was founded by Elhanan Winchester of Roxbury, Massachusetts. Originally a stern Calvinist preacher, he had been converted to Universalism by the gentle protest of an American schoolgirl, casually met in a stagecoach, against the dogmas with which he was trying to alarm her. Elhanan published a vigorous reply to Paine's Age of Reason. The centenary of his chapel was celebrated by a Paine exhibition there, and now an oil portrait of Paine by Charles Wesley Jarvis, presented by myself, hangs on its wall. In 1892 my Life of Thomas Paine appeared, and to my surprise the alumni of my old college, Dickinson, Carlisle, Pennsylvania, invited me to give their annual address, and on that occasion the college conferred on me the degree of L.H.D. In an appendix to my centenary history of my chapel, I printed an essay on liberty composed of 3 discourses which had appeared in the Open Court, Chicago. The Unitarian Christian Life attacked me for opposing all laws enacted in the interest of private morality, but I was consoled by letters of approval from Herbert Spencer, who had long passed out of our London circles by removing to St. Leonards-on-Sea. On December 12, 1893, he wrote, "I am glad to see you still busy with your pen, and it seems to me with unflagging vigor. Judging from what I've seen in the notices, for I have not seen the book itself, which indeed I should not be able to read, you have done an important service in your Life of Paine alike in clearing his reputation and showing his merits, and also by re-emphasizing some of his views. I've just been reading in the Open Court your first article on liberty, and have read it with great satisfaction. Napoleon's dictum was perfectly just, and I am startled to find he had long ago enunciated a view which I have often expressed with respect to the French, caring for equality but not for liberty. Though the same characteristic does not hold so completely of the English and the Americans as it does of the French, still it holds in large measure. As you rightly point out, people do not at all understand the principles of liberty. But here, I think, is a shortcoming in your conception. They have no true idea of liberty because they have no true sentiment of liberty. No theory is of much service in the matter without a character responding to the theory, without a feeling which prompts the assertion of individual freedom and is indignant against aggressions upon that freedom, whether against self or others. Men care nothing about a principle, even if they understood it, unless they have emotions responding to it. When adequately strong, the appropriate emotion prompts resistance to interference with individual action, whether by an individual tyrant or by a tyrant majority. But at present, in the absence of the appropriate emotion, there exists almost everywhere the miserable superstition that the majority has a right to dictate to the individual about everything whatever. I think you could not do a better thing than devote your energies to enlightening people upon this matter. It is the one thing about which politicians and people at large are utterly in the dark, and to dissipate the superstition that the majority has unlimited powers is of more importance than anything else in the field of politics. The dictum of Napoleon I Spencer referred to I found in 10. The people do not care about liberty. What they want is equality. Those who care for liberty are a few peculiar persons. In a postscript, Spencer says, "What a far-seeing man Turgot was." This was suggested by my quotation from a letter of Turgot to his friend Rev. Dr. Price of London, who had written him triumphantly about the Revolution in America. "I write to you no more about the Americans," says Turgot, "for whatever be the issue of this war, I have somewhat lost the hope of seeing on the earth a nation really free and living without war. This spectacle is reserved for very remote ages." On January 10, 1894, Herbert Spencer wrote to me, again spontaneously, "I have just been reading your third essay in The Open Court, and entirely agree with it. How entirely I agree with its essential principle as set forth in the paragraph I enclose, you may judge if you will turn to my first book, Social Statistics. You will find there a statement of that same position which you set forth, namely that no restriction save that imposed by the law of equal freedom is to be tolerated, since any other restriction is liable to prevent man's nature from growing into its most desirable form. I should be very glad to see your essays in some developed shape put before the English public. You might take for your title Liberty versus Equality, and for motto the sentence you quote from Napoleon. I agree with you that little is to be done. The wave of opinion carrying us toward socialism is becoming irresistible, but still we ought severally to do our little, if not with a view to immediate effect, yet with a view to effect in time to come. The paragraph of my article enclosed by Herbert Spencer is subjoined. Among our faculties the moral sense now alone claims absoluteness, and in these days, when the moral sentiment is borrowing the enthusiasm of religion, it is important to consider whether this reinforced power is using scientific methods or merely giving new lease to notions related to discredited systems. The increasing tendency to invoke legal authority for the regulation of private conduct has succeeded to the declining authority which regulated religious belief and worship. As it is now certain that the enforcement of creeds retarded religious progress for many ages, it may be fairly suspected that moral legislation will retard ethical, consequently social, progress, unless the enforced morality be perfect and infallible. But it would require human omniscience to determine such perfection, and by consensus of ethical philosophers our moral systems are defective, their social results unsatisfactory. Legal repression of moral differentiation is therefore, so far as effectual, practically prohibitive of improvement, from the danger of the general principle involved in such laws. Of course, the reference here is to strictly private conduct, that is, to conduct which directly concerns the individual agent alone. Human laws exist only to prevent one from injuring another or others, that is, from violating individual rights or public order. The law has no right to enslave a man, and it does make a slave of that man whose free will is coerced in matters directly concerning himself alone. That amounts to a majority of numbers suppressing, by brute force, a variation which, however popularly abhorred, may be as useful and productive as the variation of a crucified Jesus or a poisoned Socrates. It is truly claimed by moral coercionists that a man's private conduct necessarily involves others, but the laws cannot justly deal with indirect injuries which cannot be defined. A person may injure his or her relatives by becoming a monk or nun, or marrying out of their station, or emigrating. Men's virtues even sometimes turn out to others' harm, and their vices incidentally cause some benefit. The virtuous Roman emperors, Marcus Aurelius for instance, were moved by their sincerity to persecute Christians, who were tolerated by the hypocritical, who inwardly despised the gods they outwardly worshipped. The just law cannot deal with inferential and uncalculable, but only with actual, injuries. The greatest legal crimes of history have been done in the name of morality, as in the execution of Jesus for his immorality in violating the Sabbath laws and blasphemy laws of his country. Many a man has similarly suffered whose immorality is now morality. As to Herbert Spencer's idea that Napoleon's dictum was more applicable to the French than to the English and American peoples, I could only regard it as a sort of academic superstition. Even Emerson had his superstition about France, as shown in his quatrain Natura in Minimis, first printed in my Cincinnati Dial, March 1860. As sings the pine tree in the wind, so sings in the wind a sprig of the pine. Her strength and soul has laughing France, shed in each drop of wine. Had it not been for France, and especially for George Sand, the pleas of Herbert Spencer and J.S. Mill for personal liberty would probably never have been written. In the very year in which the above letter was written, the art students of Paris were engaged in defending their liberty against Berenger, who was trying to import from England its oppressions of all freedom not puritanical. In May 1896 my wife was obliged to undergo an operation. During her long illness I wrote my Solomon and Solomonic Literature, published by the Open Court Company, Chicago. My wife appeared to be steadily recovering, but in May 1897 complications supervened, and a consultation of physicians decided that she could not recover. My connection with South Place Chapel at once ended, and I brought her to New York, where she died in the house of our daughter, Mrs. Sawyer, on Christmas Day, 1897. She was cremated with the exhumed body of our son Dana. Their ashes are in Kensico Cemetery. I issued a leaflet for the perusal of our friends concerning her life and death. Here I say no more. That way madness lies. Broken by personal bereavement, filled with horror by the reign of terror suffered by Negroes in the South, alienated from my countrymen by what seemed to me a mere lynching of Spain, my youthful visions turned to illusions. I left for Europe. In June 1898 I gave several discourses to my old congregation in London, but there also the sky was overcast. England, too, was preparing to enter on a murderous career of aggression, and some of the most distinguished liberal thinkers were following Chamberlain in that direction. He had given to Birmingham the reputation of being the ideal Unitarian city, but was now proving that the orthodox nonconformists were more humane than the Unitarians. Thomas Paine used to say that the world would never have peace until the English people saw war at their own doors, and it looks as if he were right. Lord Salisbury, under whom the British lion became a mouse when bullied by the president of 80 millions, Cleveland, became doubly ferocious when it was the president of a handful of Dutch farmers who entreated arbitration, seems to have known this, and orders were sent out to South Africa that no wounded men were to be brought home. When I arrived in Paris, I learned from Professor A. Aulard of the Sorbonne, editor of La Révolution Française, journal of a society for the study of the French Revolution, that 6 articles had appeared in that periodical on my Life and Writings of Thomas Paine, and that there was a desire for the French translation of the biography. The writer of the reviews, M. Félix Rabe, called on me, and an arrangement was at once made for our working together on Paine. The delightful old gentleman had once been a priest, but had left the church and married. In my Hôtel de Strasbourg we used to sit pleasantly in collaboration, and we were both surprised to find as we proceeded how many coincidences with the events of the French Revolution were occurring in the Dreyfus struggle raging round us. Similar principles were involved. Marat, Robespierre, Barrère were easily recognized. Daily I read articles worthy of Junius, Condorcet, Courbet. Nay, even Paine was at times recalled by Georges Clemenceau's leaders in L'Aurore. Of especial value to me in Paris was the friendship of John G. Alger, an Englishman on the London Times staff in Paris, author of Glimpses of the French Revolution, Englishmen in the French Revolution, and other works of original investigation. A little controversy we had in the London Athenaeum brought us together. As others go fox hunting, Alger and I hunted up the localities connected with the revolutionary characters in Paris. I discovered that the Hôtel de Strasbourg, 50 Rue de Richelieu, in which I was writing about Paine, was but a little way from the Hôtel Philadelphia, where Paine stayed when he arrived in Paris, and where he was arrested, and in the same street was the Hotel of the Monroes, where they nursed Paine back to life after his release. My hotel was but 5 doors down from the house, now Hôtel Colbert, where Part II of The Age of Reason was printed. I knew nothing of these proximities when I fixed myself in the Hôtel de Strasbourg, nor that it was the house where Madame de Pompadour, as someone said, committed the only fault of her life, that of being born. My French work appeared, Maison Blanc, at the beginning of 1900 under the title Thomas Paine, 1737 à 1809, et la Révolution dans les deux mondes. It contains much that is not in my English work, and is the only book in which the relations between France and America throughout the revolutions in both countries are given with detail and authentication. One document in it, of extreme historic importance, came into my hands from the late George Clinton Genet of New York. This lawyer was a son of the famous Genet, the ambassador sent to the United States early in 1793. The desire of the revolutionary republic in France to transfer to itself the alliance formed with the decapitated Louis XVI led it to entrust to Ambassador Genet 2 long letters of Beaumarchais, of which one reveals the intrigues of a ministerial ring with Beaumarchais to extort money fraudulently from the Americans. The writings about the French subsidies by the French and American historians are proved erroneous by this memoir secret, sent by Beaumarchais to de Vergennes. The memoir secret shows that the king was without knowledge of the intrigue, and believed that his subsidy was going genuinely and gratuitously to the Americans. In May 1900 in Paris, I read in an English magazine a touching tribute by Miss Frances Power Cobbe to Dr. Martineau, and sent her a paper of my own with a letter saying that I did so in loyalty to our old friendship, though I did not suppose she could agree with some of my criticisms. I received from her a letter dated at Hangwort, Dolgelly, North Wales, May 19, in which she said, "That we should renew in our old age the acquaintanceship of long past years, and tell each other a little of where life's long voyage over seas of thought has landed us, seems to me rather affecting, and I can but respond to your friendly letter heartily in the same spirit. Thank you for writing, and also for sending me your article in the Open Court, which I have read with much interest and a good deal of agreement. Martineau's optimism never commended itself to me, because he obviously never really felt the agony of the riddle of the painful earth, and only approached it from the intellectual side. In particular, it would seem as if the wide and terrible subject of the suffering of animals, to which no theories of the beneficent purposes of human pain can possibly apply, had never come home to him, since he can be satisfied with the explanation that good comes to the species, though the individual creature perishes most miserably. Tennyson went much deeper when in his Dream claimed justice for each individual sentient creature, however humble, that not a moth with vain desire shall perish in a fruitless fire, or but subserve another's gain. It is on this side, and I think only on this side, that I have felt Martineau insufficient. But where are we to find the teacher who will lead us out of this wilderness? You cut the knot by abandoning the idea of a moral agent at the helm of the universe, and I can quite see how much is to be said for the view, which was poor Mivart's last expression of doubt or faith, that the great inscrutable energy behind nature is something very different from the God worshipped by Christians or theists. But to me, after beating my feeble wings against the bars for 60 years, I remain a believer in a Father of spirits, who must be just, else where did we gain this supreme, sublime craving for justice? Certainly not from any set of the brain acquired at any epoch by any generation of mankind from experience. But I did not mean to touch on the controversies which have occupied so much of both your life and mine, only to express my feelings respecting the points on which you criticize Martineau. I am very old and growing feebler, and losing my sight and activity, and, which is far more sad, I am alone, for my beloved Mary Lloyd died in my arms 3 years ago. I am living still, quite alone, in what was her house, which quite unlooked-for riches have enabled me to take on lease for my life. It is a beautiful old place, and I am lucky in possessing excellent and affectionate servants, and dear beasts in plenty, dogs and horses, cows and herds, a rookery and a heronry in the woods. But old age and solitude, facing for ever nearer and nearer the great dark door, is a solemn thing indeed. I rejoice heartily to hear that you have happy and affectionate children, and a little grandchild to cherish and keep your heart young. May you have yet many peaceful and happy years. End of chapter 51, part 3. Chapter 52, Part 4 of Autobiography, Memories, and Experiences, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Arlene Stebbins. Autobiography, Memories, and Experiences, Volume 2, by Moncure Conway. Chapter 52, Part 4. Mrs. Daniel Lothrop, present owner of the Wayside, the pretty home of Nathaniel Hawthorne in Concord, Massachusetts, had the happy enterprise to make the centennial birthday of the unique author, July 4th, 1904, the occasion of a literary fête. With beautiful hospitality she entertained in her house Julia Ward Howe, Thomas Wentworth Higginson, and myself, of Hawthorne's acquaintance, and with some of the younger generation, among these Beatrix Hawthorne, granddaughter of the great man, we the survivors held memorable symposia. As I had some work to do, our hostess placed me in Hawthorne's tower, where I penciled some thoughts which have connected themselves with a droll incident. On the first day of the fête, Wentworth Higginson spoke out in the grove in his characteristic vein of subtle wit and wisdom, and Beatrix, a lovely maid of 20, a mystical apparition of her grandfather, drew aside the American flag which veiled a tablet of the author who walked there. On the second day of the fête, in the hall of the School of Philosophy, I presided, and while the Honourable Charles Frauds Adams was speaking, there was suddenly a flutter of excitement among the front row of seats, all occupied by ladies. A snake, about 1 foot long, had crept through a hole near the low platform's base, raised its head from the floor, and remained motionless. A gentleman near the side door moved quickly down in front of the ladies, picked up the snake in his hand, and carried it to the door, where he gently threw it out. The speaker had stopped, and when the snake was seen perfectly still in the gentleman's hand, there was laughter. F. B. Sanborn increased the laughter by calling out the title of Hawthorne's tale, "The Man with a Snake in His Bosom." In that school of philosophy famous teachers have been heard, Emerson, Alcott, Dr. Harris, and others. No doubt each of them might have found the visit of the snake suggestive. Emerson might have described it as a line of grace, and its harmless beauty an illustration of optimism, nothing really evil. Alcott might have seen it as a symbol of Hawthorne's demonic genius. Any pious listener might have seen it as a sign of the old serpent still offering man the forbidden fruit of philosophy. To my eyes, the snake, and the flustered ladies, and the fine-looking gentleman who took it in his hand and restored it to the forest, made a pretty fable of the author we were talking about. The little garden snake was really as harmless as a riband, and there was just enough shrinking as it passed, and anxiety until the hole in the plank was stopped, to remind us that even in that cultured audience the prettiest and most innocent little snake could not be detached from the bad reputation of its race. It is in our nerves. That little snake made me laugh in the chapel, but that night I dreamed of seeing a big Virginian black snake. In fact, the snake is the consecrated symbol of all purposeless and crafty evil in nature, that is, of diabolism. And that which has got into our nerves is not so much dread of the serpent's venom as a subconscious dread of the dark and potentially evil forces within us related to those around us. Now it was in this dread realm that the genius of Hawthorne moved, with the vision of Dante, but without the superstition of Dante. The schools of philosophy have eliminated Satan, and optimism even declares there is no real evil. But human consciousness knows that the dissolution of Satan only brings man the more immediately face to face with the perils and passions in his own breast. All the optimism in the world does not prevent us from contending with the tares, the diseases and agonies and desolating passions, just the same as if those tares were sown amid the wheat by an enemy of man. That same day, July 5th, was the centennial of the one story-teller of the 19th century who can rank Hawthorne, George Sand. As I grow older, I more and more recognize that the genius of the 19th century is stored in the 100 volumes of that miraculous woman. When a man's supernatural faith has departed, and his early dreams of a fair and peaceful world turn to illusions, his haven is Paris. There, at least, the work of creation continues. Sitting in the atelier of fine sculptors like Codin and Spicer Simpson, and seeing clay spiritualized in noblest forms, or among the painters who transfigure humble models into saints and goddesses, I have felt that with these chiefly the way-worn, weather-beaten pilgrims who have sought shrines only to find them tinsel, and entered temples that crumbled round them, find some blue sky still bending over the world. Here, at least, is no dogmatizing, no throat-cutting, but master builders surrounding the human spirit with the truth and beauty of life. Truth? It was said that Rufus Choate described truth as a form of art. It was quoted with a smile as if an apology for falsehood. But the great lawyer had probably discovered how much art it requires to convey truth about any occurrence, and how misleading may be a merely literal veracity. Would any unbiased student of history, theology, and ethics say that the library of such works contains as much truth as the library of so-called fiction? In Paris I read La douceur de croire by Jacques Normand, this quatrain. Le bonheur humain est fait de mensonges, qui rendent à tous les chagrins moins lourds. Que sombre serait la trame des jours, si Dieu ne mêlait les filles d'heure des songes. It seems a pity that the poet could not find to rhyme with songe a more felicitous word than mensonge, but his deity mingling with the weft of days the golden threads of illusion appears more attractive than a deity menacing with hell every mind that cannot take the illusions seriously. In Italy, Nathaniel Hawthorne, moved by sacred pictures, lamented that Protestantism had never been, by such means, ministered to his religious sentiment. O.B. Frothingham, after laboring in the field of free thought for a quarter of a century, found that it made no headway, led to nothing, but in Italy found among the humble parish priests, ignorant, unambitious, and superstitious, a power which must mystify philosophers. Frothingham asked, "What is this power? I cannot undertake to say." But standing on the shoulders of those great forerunners, mingling with the humble priests and moved by the sacred pictures, I venture to say what I see. The old painters were potent because they believed seriously the tales of ancient Hawthornes, who wrote of Mary Magdalene as our great author wrote of Hester Prynne, and of Judas as he wrote of the man with a snake in his bosom. The modern parish priest has power because he is superstitious, and still more because he is unambitious. He neither aims nor hopes to make any headway. The humble priest aims not at headway for dogmas, but, so to say, at heartway for visions and dreams that touch the heart, and whose reality he is not learned enough to question. Those who think at all think freely. They cannot take seriously the ancient illusions, but believe as genuinely in the heart of their own illusions. In Boccaccio, Rabelais, Shakespeare, Balzac, George Sand, Hawthorne, the fiction is the embroidered vestiture of truth in the heart and in the nature of things. We lose the truth when we seek it in the revelations of other ages, as we would lose the rainbow in searching for the fabled treasure at its end. The superstition of today is our inveterate belief that the world exists for some other coming world, in heaven or on earth. Woman is missing the grand benefits of her disenfranchisement in the rage for a franchise that would be found dross if attained. Men go to war and rejoice in victory. I have witnessed enough wars to cry in my heart, Voi victoribus, and seeing the intellectual and artistic supremacy of France these 30 years, cry, Laetitia victis. During the conflict about Dreyfus in France, which I witnessed, the admirable author Paul Sabatier said to me, Avait-on jamais vu dans l'histoire ou dans la légende pareille coalition de toutes les puissances ténébreuses? Certainly not, I answered, nor in history has there ever been seen a coalition of the powers of darkness confronted by such a coalition of the forces of light. In a single protest against the wrong to an obscure Jew, I counted nearly 400 names of the men highest in French science, literature, and art. That was the victory of France. The cause of justice in that case was begun and carried on for 4 years by unofficial citizens. They were resisted and punished by government after government, and happily militarism never yielded its prey. It preferred to degrade itself by perjuries and brutalities which revealed to the world its interior blackness, as well as its brainlessness in not recognizing its last chance of rehabilitation offered at Rennes. That was the only victory worth anything. The restoration of Dreyfus to the army would have been defeat. Instead of being rescued to a commonplace man in livery under the orders of base generals, Dreyfus is now one of the most enviable men in Europe. It is 100-fold compensation for all his sufferings that he has been the means of instructing the French people in the principles of law and human rights, more in 2 years than they had learned in any 2 centuries, and in administering to militarism the heaviest blow it ever received. My dear friend, M. Paul Guieyesse, deputy and ex-minister, wrote me that his son, a rising young officer, was so appalled by the revelations made of the honor rooted in dishonor prevailing among the military chieftains that he resigned his place in the army and abandoned his profession. I was assured that there were other cases of the kind. The military officers who under the Republic had come to wear the mantle of aristocracy fallen from the titled noblesse retain their prestige only among the young vulgarians. At the Paris Exposition, 1900, America had 3 unique exhibits. Exhibit 1, the American Sabbath. Our pavilion and all our exhibits were closed on the weekly fete of the Exposition, this being equivalent for the masses to closing them altogether. Exhibit 2, equestrian statue of George Washington, bareheaded, sword pointing skyward, interpretable as the general deifying his sword or defying heaven. Exhibit 3, 1 or 2,000 angry Americans surrounding a big bandbox-like structure inside which a statue of Lafayette was being unveiled by Lafayette's descendants, and presented to France by the American ambassador in the name of the Dames of the Revolution. This Exhibit 3 calls for a note. These excluded Americans had obtained tickets which they supposed would admit them to the function, but they were only admitted to the impenetrable outside wall where they could see and hear nothing. But we who had seats within could hear them, for their uproar was loud enough to make a discordant chorus to the eloquent French of Ambassador Porter and Bishop Ireland, and to drown at times the voices of President Loubet and other French speakers. Finally the noises took a harmonious turn. The disappointed Americans joined in singing, almost shouting, the patriotic hymn America. Alas, nothing could have been more inappropriate. The verses being inaudible, there floated up to this company, consisting mainly of the chief personages of France, a strain known to them as God Save the King. The previous uproar was musical compared to this discordant note, which proved it an English mob gathered to insult the memory of Lafayette and heap contempt on the Franco-American rapport. There were flashing eyes and whispers from one to another of «Les Anglais! Les Anglais!» and although we Americans tried to explain to Frenchmen near us that it was an American hymn, the majority of them went off with the belief that England, which had shown marked coolness to the Exposition, had sent a contingent sufficient for a manifestation of jealousy and spite. Stupid? Nay, complimentary. These French gentlemen and ladies could not imagine such a lack of originality in Americans that after all the generations elapsed since their independence, They had no national anthem except that sung when they were subjects of the British Crown. In 1900, being in Paris, I was visited by Hodgson Pratt, the venerable leader of the Peace Society in London, where I had long cooperated with him, and president of the International League of Peace and Arbitration in Europe. In view of the approaching Peace Congress in Paris, he came to inquire about a proposal of mine mentioned by Herbert Spencer in a letter to Grant Allen, quoted in Claude's biography of Allen. The plan was to secure an unofficial arbitration by the most eminent jurists and publicists of all nations on every dispute that threatened peace. A court formed of unofficial men like Montmorency, Virchow, Zola, Spencer, President Eliot, whose judgment, though it could not be enforced, would strengthen the party of peace in each country menacing another. My scheme was stated in an address before the Free Religious Association, Boston, in May 1898, and I wrote about it to Herbert Spencer. In his reply from Maidstone, July 17, 1898, Spencer said, "I sympathize with your feelings and your aims, but not in your hopes. In 1882, though in consequence of my nervous disorder I had deliberately kept out of all public action, my interest in the matter prompted me to join with some others in trying to establish an anti-aggression league, and permanently wrecked my health in consequence, which should check our filibustering policy and tend towards peace. The movement failed utterly, and ever since I have seen that in people's present mood nothing can be done in that direction. Now that the white savages of Europe are overrunning the dark savages everywhere, now that the European nations are vying with one another in political burglaries, now that we have entered upon an era of social cannibalism, in which the strong nations are devouring the weaker, now that the national interests, national prestige, pluck, and so forth are alone thought of, and equity has utterly dropped out of thought, while rectitude is scorned as unctuous, it is useless to resist the wave of barbarism. There is a bad time coming, and civilized mankind will morally be uncivilized before civilization can again advance. Such a body as that which you propose, even could its members agree, would be pooh-poohed as sentimental and visionary. The universal aggressiveness and universal culture of bloodthirst will bring back military despotism, out of which, after many generations, partial freedom may again emerge. I remark in this fatalism of Herbert Spencer some unconscious survival of that ancient faith which developed the devil into being at once the enemy and the ally of God. Why should partial freedom emerge again from military despotism after many generations or ever? Though aggressiveness and bloodthirst seem universal in several nations, there is distributed through these and all nations a moral and peaceful nation. And my aim was to organize this moral nation sufficiently to reinforce the peace party in each country threatening war, by bringing to its aid the judgment of the best representatives of civilization as to the path of justice. They need agree but in one thing, that war can settle nothing except which country is the strongest. The fact that Herbert Spencer had written to Grant Allen something which I had not seen, and that Hodgson Pratt had adopted my idea, gave me a ground for writing again to Herbert Spencer. He replied, writing from Bepton Rectory, Sussex, August 15, 1900, that he had not seen the reference in Claude's biography of Grant Allen, and in conclusion said, "If I was not encouraged to hope for any benefit from your plan at the time," I wrote in 1898, "I am still less encouraged now. The process of rebarbarization, which has long been going on, is now going on at an increasing rate, and will continue to go on. Waves of human opinion and passion are not to be arrested until they have spent themselves. You appear to think, as I used to think in earlier days, that mankind are rational beings, and that when a thing has been demonstrated they will be convinced. Everything proves to the contrary. A man is a bundle of passions which severally use his reason to get gratification, and the result in all times and all places depends on what passions are dominant. At present there is an unusual resurgence of the passions of the brute. Still more now than a generation ago, men pride themselves not in those faculties and feelings which distinguish them as human beings, but in those which they have in common with inferior beings, pride themselves in approaching as nearly as they can to the character of the bulldog." Hogston Pratt recognized that my aim was to control the bulldog in a nation by exciting its pride, to stand well in the eyes of the most eminent thinkers and jurists of the world. He agreed with me that the friends of peace must make some new departure. The old peace societies had been pleading for generations. Everybody professed love of peace, but war went on all the same. A company was invited to listen to my statement in the Republican Club, and they all agreed with it, though one or two French gentlemen could not quite appreciate my insistence on the principle that the arbiters must in no case be officially connected with their own or any government. This principle was essential, and in the pamphlet I was requested to write it was pointed out that it was impossible to secure an unbiased opinion, or one not liable to suspicion, from an official. My pamphlet was translated into French and German, and distributed to all in the Peace Congress at Paris, 1900. It was vaguely approved in an incidental resolution, but the Congress had gathered mainly to utter triumphal shouts over the Hague Conventions. It was only in the theatrical reviews that the tragical comedy of the Hague Conventions was truly recognized. In one, a member of the Hague Congress informs the compere, "Henceforth we are to fight all the same, but fight pacifically." The old peacemen were so anxious to believe that their cause had at length triumphed that it was vain to point out to them that the Hague Congress had at best only left nations where they had always been, free to arbitrate or free to fight as their interests or passions might dictate. But for myself I then declared that the Hague Congress had given a new lease to war by including it among civilized methods. It was, I said, fundamental in our issue to affirm that there is no such thing as civilized warfare. I might have expected some sympathizers, after the Hague Court in the Venezuela case put a premium on war by deciding that a creditor who approaches his debtor with a gun shall have precedence in payment over the creditor who makes his request like a gentleman. But no. The First National Peace Congress of Great Britain, which met in June 1904 at Manchester, justified the decision, albeit with regrets, at the encouragement given to murder as a means of collecting debts. The venerable apostle of peace, Hogston Pratt, wrote to the Congress, "At last I must fall out of the ranks because old age has overtaken me." His words express the condition of all the old peace societies. They have fallen out of the ranks through the senility indicated in their acceptance of the Hague Court with its civilized warfare and debt collecting by bloodshed as a principle of international law. In a Gnostic legend, Solomon was summoned from his tomb and asked, "Who first named the name of God?" "The devil," was his answer. Did reason permit belief in a personal devil, one might recognize the supreme diabolical artifice in this sheltering under a holy name of all the desolating cruelties of men, all the wars that have degraded mankind into egotistic aggregates or nations, glorying in their ensigns of inhumanity. The popular belief in progress as something going on in the world under a divine order sanctions all scourges as the scourge of God, and ensures social deterioration. When an evil is pointed out, the answer is, "Yes, but things will improve." It is like saying of a habitual debauchee that the longer his bad habits continue, the more likely he is to break them. But in big things like nations, deity is supposed to be concerned, and rules of individual experience set aside. Providence in its own good time will do thus and so. We shall have a new race of great statesmen, orators, authors, artists. Enough deterioration lurks in that infatuation to interpret the Gnostic legend of a devil-invented deity. When I visited J. G. Whittier at his pretty home near Amesbury toward the close of his life, I found the beautiful old gentleman who had faced mobs and undergone ordeals, playing croquet against himself out among the many-colored autumn leaves. We had a long talk about old anti-slavery days, and his poetic fire rekindled. The great moral cause had been his inspiration. It made him a poet. From his solitude he beheld in vision the travail of his soul, and was satisfied. He remains in my memory as a fruit of the moral spirit that breathed over the nation like tropical air and brought forth every seed of talent to its fullness. It would be only a source of personal sorrow to those who moved amid the stately growths of literature and art in England, Germany, and America in the last century that they can meet such no more, were their place filled with happy and peaceful populations. But under the air now breathing abroad spring up armed men, eager to strew the earth with dead bodies. The great prizes of the foremost Saxon nations are bestowed for successful manslaughter. There can arise no important literature, nor art, nor real freedom and happiness among any people until they feel their uniform a livery, and see in every battlefield an inglorious arena of human degradation. The only cause that can uplift the genius of a people as the anti-slavery cause did in America is the war against war. It appears but too probable that my old eyes must close upon a world given over to the murderous exploitation of the weak nations by the strong, even the new peace treaties between the latter being apparently alliances for mutual support in devouring helpless tribes and their lands. There are indeed a few hopeful signs. The grand victory of the unofficial pen over the sword in the Dreyfus case, in France, and the burgeoning of Spanish genius since the two ulcers, Cuba and Manila, that wasted Spain were removed, inspire my hope that what Lord Salisbury called the decadence of those nations will prove their ascent. My last essays, translated into French by M. Henri Monod, have been well received by the Paris press. One of these was an address delivered before the Graduates' Club in Columbia University, which aimed to dissipate the delusions about American history which have consecrated the sword. And now, at the end of my work, I offer yet a new plan for ending war, namely, that the friends of peace and justice shall insist on a demand that every declaration of war shall be regarded as a sentence of death by one people on another, and shall be made only after a full and formal judicial inquiry and trial, at which the accused people shall be fairly represented. This was suggested to me by my old friend Professor Newman, who remarked that no war in history had been preceded by a judicial trial of the issue. The meanest prisoner cannot be executed without a trial. A declaration of war is the most terrible of sentences. It sentences a people to be slain and mutilated, their women to be widowed, their children orphaned, their cities burned, their commerce destroyed. The real motives of every declaration of war are unavowed and unavowable. Let them be dragged into the light. No war would ever occur after fair judicial trial by a tribunal in any country open to its citizens. Implora pace, O my reader, from whom I now part. Implore peace, not of deified thunderclouds, but of every man, woman, and child thou shalt meet. Do not merely offer the prayer, give peace in our time, but do thy part to answer it. Then, at least, though the world be at strife, there shall be peace in thee. Farewell. End of chapter 52. End of Autobiography, Memories, and Experiences, Volume 2, by Moncure Conway.